I watch the light change across the land the way it always has, the way it did 10,000 years ago when everything began to shift. The world is quieter here, softer somehow, as though time itself has slowed to the rhythm of growing things, to the patient unfolding of seasons that carry their own ancient knowledge. There are no cities yet, no roads stretching toward distant horizons, only the gentle undulation of the hills and valleys, the slow curve of rivers finding their paths through soil that has never known the plow. But something is stirring, something profound and irrevocable, a transformation so gradual that no single lifetime could perceive its full arc, yet so complete that it would remake the human world entirely. I find myself drawn to the edges of this change, to the threshold between one way of being and another, where the old patterns still hold their shape, but new possibilities whisper in the wind. The grasses here grow tall and wild, their seed heads heavy with potential, swaying in great golden waves that seem to stretch toward every edge of the known world. And in their movement there is something almost hypnotic, something that speaks of abundance and continuity. These are not the grasses of later times, not the orderly rows that will one day march across continents, but their ancestors, the wild progenitors that offer their gifts freely to any creature wise enough to gather them. The air carries scents both familiar and strange. Wood smoke drifting from fires that burn in patterns different from those that came before. The earthy sweetness of grain being ground between stones. The warm mineral smell of clay being shaped by human hands. I notice the way settlements nestle into the landscape, not imposing themselves upon it, but seeming to emerge from it, as though the earth itself had decided to take a new form, to express itself through walls of mud and stone, through roofs of thatch and timber. These structures hold a different quality than the temporary shelters of earlier peoples, a sense of rootedness, of intention that extends beyond the immediate season, beyond the next migration, into a future that had not existed before. The rhythm of days here follows patterns both ancient and revolutionary. The rising sun still marks the beginning of light and warmth. The setting sun still signals the drawing in of darkness. But between these eternal markers, something new is unfolding. I watch figures moving through morning mist, their movements purposeful but unhurried, tending to tasks that their ancestors could not have imagined, coaxing sustenance from the earth itself, participating in cycles they have learned to anticipate, to influence, to shape according to their needs and their growing understanding. There is knowledge here that exists in hands and muscles, in the tilt of a digging stick finding just the right angle, in the pressure of fingers separating grain from chaff, in the careful observation of weather and water and the mysterious ways that seeds become plants, become food, become life itself. The landscape holds evidence of this knowledge, small plots where the earth has been loosened and turned, where certain plants grow in concentrations that nature alone would not create, where human intention and natural process have begun their long conversation, and yet the wild world remains close, vast and present, providing much of what these people need, offering the meat of deer and aurochs, the flesh of fish from rivers and streams, the gathered roots and fruits and nuts that still make up so much of their sustenance. This is a world of careful balance, of holding multiple ways of living in a kind of dynamic tension, neither fully one thing nor another, but existing in that fertile space between where possibilities multiply and branch like the rivers spreading across alluvial plains. I feel the weight of what is happening here, the magnitude of this turning point that will echo forward through all the centuries to come, though those who live within it cannot know the full extent of what they are beginning. They are simply solving problems, finding ways to feed their families through the lean months, discovering that certain actions lead to certain outcomes, that seeds saved and planted will grow, that some animals can be kept close and bred, that clay hardens in fire and becomes something entirely new. Each small innovation carries within it the seed of transformation. Each success builds upon the last, creating a momentum that will eventually become unstoppable, though for now it moves with the slowness of geological time, with the patience of mountains being worn down by rain. The evening draws near, and the quality of the light begins to soften, casting long shadows across fields and settlements, touching everything with amber and gold. I turn my attention backward, to the time before this time, to the world as it existed when ice still covered much of the northern lands, when the great herds moved in their ancient patterns, and humans moved with them. For hundreds of thousands of years, people had lived as wanderers, following the rhythms of animals and seasons, carrying everything they owned on their backs or in their hands, leaving little trace of their passing beyond the scattered bones of meals and the worked flint of their tools. They were not primitive in their thinking, not simple in their understanding of the world, but their relationship to the land was one of movement, of taking what nature provided in its own time, of reading the signs that told them when to move and where to find abundance. The last great ice age held the world in its grip for tens of thousands of years, shaping the land with glaciers that ground mountains into valleys, that locked vast quantities of water away in frozen sheets miles thick, that pushed life into the warmer regions where survival remained possible. But ice ages do not last forever, and around 15,000 years ago, the climate began its long, slow shift toward warmth, the glaciers retreating, the sea levels rising, the land responding with changes that rippled across every ecosystem. As the ice withdrew, new landscapes emerged. Forests spread across lands that had been tundra. Grasslands expanded into territories once locked beneath frozen water, and the flora and fauna reorganized themselves into new configurations, new possibilities. In a region that would later be called the Fertile Crescent, a great arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria and down into the Levant, the conditions aligned in ways both fortunate and transformative. This was a land blessed with wild cereals, ancestors of wheat and barley that grew in dense stands across hillsides and valleys, their nutritious seeds offering sustenance to any who knew how to gather and process them, and the people here had been doing exactly that for millennia. The Natufian culture, flourishing around 12,500 years ago, had already begun to experiment with something radical. They were staying in place, building permanent settlements of circular stone houses, creating communities that existed in one location year after year. They still hunted gazelle and deer, still gathered wild plants in their seasons, but they had discovered that the wild grain fields nearby were productive enough, reliable enough, to support a different way of living, one that did not require constant movement across the landscape. Their villages held perhaps a few dozen people, maybe 100 or more in the larger settlements, and they developed tools specifically for harvesting and processing grain, sickle blades made from flint, grinding stones for turning seeds into flour, storage pits for keeping food beyond the harvest season. But they had not yet crossed the threshold into true agriculture. They were intensive gatherers, experts at exploiting wild resources, living in that transitional space between the old ways and what was to come. Then the climate shifted again. Around 10,800 years ago, a period called the Younger Dryas brought a return to colder, drier conditions, lasting for more than 1,000 years, and the wild grain fields that had supported sedentary life began to fail. Some groups returned to full nomadism, following the old patterns of movement, but others faced a different choice. They had built homes, established communities, created social bonds tied to specific places, and they were reluctant to abandon what they had made. It was in this crucible of necessity, in this narrowing of options, that some groups began to actively cultivate the plants they depended upon to save seeds from the best specimens and plant them deliberately, to clear ground and protect growing areas, to cross the invisible line into agriculture. The transition was not sudden, not a single moment of invention, but a gradual accumulation of practices and knowledge, a slow dance between human need and plant biology, each influencing the other across generations. The earliest cultivated wheat appears in the archaeological record around 10,500 years ago at sites like Abu Huraira in Syria and Netiv, Hagdud in the Jordan Valley, alongside evidence of stored grain and purpose-built structures for processing. These early farmers were still experimenting, still maintaining their hunting and gathering practices alongside the new techniques, hedging their bets against failure, living in multiple worlds simultaneously. The plants themselves began to change under human selection. Domestication leaves its marks in morphology and genetics, in ways that archaeologists can read like text, and the story they tell is one of co-evolution, of mutual transformation. Wild wheat and barley have brittle rachis, the part of the seed head that shatters easily, scattering seeds across the ground for natural dispersal. But this makes harvesting difficult. The seeds fall and are lost before they can be gathered. Farmers, whether consciously or not, selected for mutant plants with tougher rachis, ones that held their seeds, making harvest more efficient, and over generations these mutants became dominant in cultivated fields, creating plants that could no longer effectively spread their own seeds, that depended on human hands for reproduction. Similarly, seed size increased as farmers preferentially saved and planted the largest grains, creating cereals more productive and nutritious than their wild ancestors, but also more dependent on cultivation, on the care and intention of their human partners. Barley was among the first to be domesticated, its tolerance for varied conditions making it adaptable, followed closely by einkorn and emmer wheat, each with its own characteristics, its own advantages for different soils and climates. Lentils and peas joined the agricultural repertoire early, their protein-rich seeds complementing the grains, providing nutritional balance, and their ability to fix nitrogen in the soil, improving the fertility of fields where they were grown. By 9,500 years ago, the practice had spread across the Fertile Crescent, Dozens of settlements engaged in cultivation, sharing knowledge, trading seeds, developing regional variations on the fundamental theme. Jericho in the Jordan Valley grew into one of the earliest true towns, its population swelling to perhaps 3,000 people, protected by massive stone walls and a tower that still stands in ruined form, evidence of organized labor and social complexity beyond anything seen before. Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey would later become even larger, a densely packed settlement of perhaps 8,000 souls, their houses built wall to wall, entered through roof hatches, decorated with elaborate murals and sculptures, a community of unprecedented scale and sophistication. But agriculture alone did not create these changes. Another transformation was happening simultaneously, one that would prove equally revolutionary in its effects. People had long held relationships with certain animals. Dogs had been domesticated thousands of years earlier, companions in the hunt, guardians of camps. But now other species were being drawn into the human orbit. Wild sheep and goats roamed the hills of the Fertile Crescent, relatively docile compared to other prey, their herding behavior making them easier to manage. And around the same time that plant cultivation began, some communities started keeping these animals in captivity. The earliest evidence of sheep domestication appears around 10,000 years ago in the Zagros Mountains of modern Iran, where changes in the age and sex ratios of sheep bones suggest managed herds rather than wild hunting. Goats followed quickly, perhaps domesticated independently in multiple locations, their adaptability to rough terrain and varied vegetation making them ideal for the mixed landscapes where early farming communities established themselves. These animals provided meat, obviously, but also milk once they were bred for docility and milk production, and wool from sheep that were selected for fleece rather than hair, and horn and bone for tools, and dung for fuel and fertilizer. Cattle came later, around 8,000 years ago, domesticated from the fierce aurochs that stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder, a more dangerous and difficult animal to bring under control, but one that offered immense rewards in size and strength. Pigs were domesticated in multiple regions around the same time, their omnivorous diet allowing them to thrive on scraps and waste, converting unusable material into meat, filling a particular niche in the emerging agricultural ecosystem. Each domestication was its own epic, its own multi-generational story of observation and selection, of humans and animals learning to live together in new configurations, creating relationships of mutual dependence that would shape both species profoundly. The animals changed under domestication, becoming smaller, more docile, more variable in color and form than their wild ancestors, their skulls and teeth and bones reflecting the pressures of human selection and the different conditions of captive life. And humans changed too, their societies reorganizing around the demands of cultivation and herding, their calendars marked by planting and harvest, their settlements growing larger and more permanent, their social structures becoming more complex to manage the new forms of wealth and labor. By 8,000 years ago, the Neolithic transformation was in full flower across the Fertile Crescent. Hundreds of farming villages dotting the landscape, their fields spreading across valleys and up hillsides, their herds moving in managed patterns between seasonal pastures. The knowledge that had emerged in the Fertile Crescent did not remain contained within its borders. It flowed outward like water finding new channels, carried by migrants and traders, by the simple human tendency to share useful innovations, by the inexorable logic of population, pressure-seeking new lands. Into Anatolia it spread, across the high plateau where volcanic soils and winter rains created conditions favorable for wheat and barley, where communities built houses of mud brick and timber, where they plastered their walls and painted them with geometric patterns and stylized figures. Southward into the Nile Valley, though there the transformation took a different form, the annual flooding of the great river creating its own rhythms and possibilities, the rich silt deposits eliminating the need for fallowing, allowing continuous cultivation in ways the rain-fed fields of the Levant could not match. Westward into Anatolia and beyond, the agricultural package moving across the Mediterranean basin, adapted to new climates and soils, modified to incorporate local wild species, transformed by each culture that adopted it into something slightly different, slightly local. By 7,000 years ago, farming communities had appeared in Greece, on Cyprus, along the coasts of the Aegean, their pottery and tools showing clear connections to the Near Eastern traditions from which they descended, but already developing regional characteristics. Local innovations. The movement into Europe took multiple paths. A coastal route following the Mediterranean shoreline, carrying the farming complex into Italy and southern France and the Iberian Peninsula, settlements appearing like stepping stones, each one a foundation for the next wave of expansion, and a continental route pushing up the river valleys of the Danube and the Rhine, through the fertile loess soils of Central Europe, bringing agriculture into lands that had known only foragers, into forests dense and dark and rich with game. The linear band ceramic culture, named for the distinctive linear decorations on their pottery, spread across Central Europe between 7,000 and 6,500 years ago, their longhouses stretching sometimes more than 100 feet in length, sheltering extended families and their animals under single massive roofs. These communities established themselves in clearings along rivers, felling trees with stone axes, burning the slash to create fields, planting their wheat and barley and peas in soil enriched by ash. Moving on after a generation or two, when yields declined, leaving the forest to reclaim what they had taken, they brought cattle and sheep and goats, but also incorporated the hunting of red deer and wild boar, fishing in the rivers, gathering hazelnuts and wild fruits, creating a mixed economy that drew from both the agricultural toolkit and the abundant wild resources of the European landscape. The pottery they made was more than functional. It was beautiful, decorated with intricate curvilinear patterns that must have held meaning we can no longer read, each vessel a canvas for expression, for identity, for the marking of cultural boundaries and connections. Their settlements show evidence of violence sometimes, ditches and palisades suggesting defense was necessary, mass graves with marks of trauma speaking to conflicts we cannot fully understand, competition for land perhaps, or resources, or simply the friction of different groups coming into contact. But there was also trade, obsidian from Hungary appearing hundreds of miles away, spondylus shells from the Mediterranean traveling inland, creating networks of exchange that connected communities across vast distances, that facilitated the flow not just of goods, but of ideas and techniques and innovations. To the north and west, the Atlantic coast of Europe saw a different kind of Neolithic, one where the domesticated plants and animals were adopted, but combined with continued heavy reliance on marine resources, where fishing and shellfishing remained central to survival and identity. The megalith builders of this Atlantic Neolithic created some of the most enduring monuments of the entire era, massive stone tombs and ceremonial structures that required coordinated labor on an impressive scale, that speak to sophisticated social organization and spiritual beliefs. Newgrange in Ireland, built around 5,000 years ago, its passage tomb aligned to capture the light of the winter solstice sunrise, illuminating the inner chamber in a moment of precise astronomical coordination, showing knowledge and intention and a conception of time that stretched beyond individual lives. Carnac in Brittany, where thousands of standing stones march across the landscape in long parallel rows, their purpose debated, their impact undeniable, a transformation of the land into something simultaneously functional and symbolic, practical and sacred. These monuments required not just labor, but surplus, the ability to feed workers who were not producing food, which meant agricultural productivity had reached levels that could support specialization, that could create time and energy for pursuits beyond immediate subsistence. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, independent agricultural revolutions were unfolding, each one a separate experiment in the same fundamental transformation, each one proof that humans everywhere were capable of this leap when conditions aligned. In China, rice and millet were being domesticated in different regions around 9,000 years ago. The rice in the Yangtze River Valley, the millet in the Yellow River Valley, creating distinct agricultural traditions that would eventually merge and spread. The rice farmers developed sophisticated water management, learning to flood fields deliberately, to manipulate the landscape to create the conditions their crop required, transforming valleys into intricate mosaics of paddies and channels. Pigs and chickens were domesticated in China, adding to the agricultural repertoire, creating farming systems adapted to the specific ecology and climate of East Asia, different from the Near Eastern model, but achieving similar ends through different means. In Mesoamerica, maize was being developed from a wild grass called teosinte, a transformation so profound that for years scientists could not believe the two plants were related, the tiny seed head of the ancestor becoming the large cob of the descendant through millennia of selection. Squash and beans joined maize in the agricultural trinity of the Americas. The three sisters, as they would later be called, planted together in a mutually beneficial relationship, the beans fixing nitrogen, the squash shading the ground, the maize providing a structure for the beans to climb. This happened gradually, over thousands of years, the earliest evidence of cultivation appearing around 9,000 years ago, but full dependence on agriculture not emerging until much later, the transition drawn out, tentative, reversible for long periods. In the Andes, potatoes were domesticated from wild species growing at high altitudes, along with quinoa and other crops adapted to the thin air and cold nights of mountain agriculture, creating food systems that could support dense populations in environments that seemed inhospitable. Llamas and alpacas, the only large domesticated animals of the Americas, provided transport and fiber and occasionally meat, though never the pulling power of cattle or horses, never the same potential for intensive agriculture that draft animals enabled in the Old World. In Africa, south of the Sahara, sorghum and pearl millet were domesticated in the Sahel region, along with African rice in the Niger Delta, yams in West Africa, teff in the Ethiopian highlands, each region developing crops suited to local conditions, to local needs and preferences. The spread of agriculture in Africa was complicated by the presence of tsetse flies in humid regions, making it difficult to keep cattle in vast areas, by different rainfall patterns, by the north-south orientation of the continent that meant crops had to cross climate zones rather than spreading along similar latitudes, but spread it did, agriculture eventually reaching most of Africa, transforming societies, enabling population growth, creating the foundation for the kingdoms and empires that would rise in later millennia. Back in the Near East and Europe, the Middle Neolithic saw continued innovation and elaboration. Pottery became more sophisticated, kiln technology improving, forms diversifying, decoration becoming more complex and regionally distinctive. Metallurgy emerged, first with copper worked cold like stone, then heated and annealed to improve its properties, eventually smelted from ore around 7,000 years ago in the Near East, opening entirely new possibilities for tools and ornaments and weapons. Copper axes could hold an edge better than stone. Copper awls could pierce leather more easily. Copper ornaments could be cast in forms impossible with other materials, though stone tools remained dominant for most purposes, copper being too soft for many applications and too rare to replace the lithic technology that had served humans for hundreds of thousands of years. The plow was invented, or perhaps discovered is more accurate. Someone realizing that a modified digging stick pulled by an animal could break ground more efficiently than human muscle alone, transforming agriculture from a labor-intensive garden cultivation to something approaching field agriculture. This happened around 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Simple ORD plows scratching furrows in the soil, not turning it over like later moldboard plows would, but still a revolutionary increase in the amount of land a single family could cultivate. With plows came a shift toward male-dominated field labor, the heavy work of controlling animals and guiding plows becoming associated with men in many cultures, while women continued to manage household gardens and processing and storage, creating gender divisions of labor that had not existed in the same form among foragers. The wheel appeared around 5,500 years ago, first for pottery, the potter's wheel allowing new forms and greater speed of production, then adapted for transport, solid wooden wheels fixed to axles, pulled by oxen, moving goods in quantities previously impossible. Irrigation developed in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, channels dug to bring water to fields beyond the reach of natural flooding, allowing cultivation of larger areas, but also requiring coordination and maintenance, creating the need for more complex social organization. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities, the first urban centers emerging in Sumer around 5,500 years ago. Uruk swelling to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, an unprecedented concentration of humanity, requiring new forms of governance and economic organization. Writing emerged from the accounting needs of these early cities, tokens and seals giving way to impressed clay tablets, pictographs representing goods and quantities, gradually evolving into cuneiform script that could represent speech itself, that could preserve knowledge and contracts and stories across time. The transformation that writing represented cannot be overstated, For the first time in human history, knowledge could be preserved exactly, transmitted across generations without the distortions of oral tradition, accumulated in libraries and archives, creating an external memory that exceeded the capacity of any individual mind. But writing was a tool of the elite initially, scribes trained in specialized schools, their skills serving the needs of temples and palaces, recording tribute and tax, inventories and contracts, the administrative apparatus of increasingly complex societies. The Neolithic had by this point, around 5,000 years ago, fully transitioned into something else in the most developed regions, into what archaeologists call the Chalcolithic or Copper Age, and in some places into the early Bronze Age, as tin was alloyed with copper to create a harder, more versatile metal. Yet vast areas of the world remained fully Neolithic in their technology and economy. The transition to metalworking spreading unevenly, determined by access to ore deposits and trade networks, by cultural preferences and economic systems, by the particular trajectory of each society. In Britain, the Neolithic persisted until around 4,000 years ago, communities still using primarily stone tools, still building in timber and earth rather than mud brick and stone, still organizing their societies around kinship and clan rather than the urban hierarchies emerging in the Near East. Stonehenge rose in stages across this British Neolithic, beginning around 5,000 years ago with a simple circular earthwork, evolving over centuries into the massive stone circle whose ruins still stand, each phase representing enormous investments of labor, requiring coordination across multiple communities. Speaking to belief systems and social structures we can only glimpse through archaeology. The bluestones transported from Wales, some 150 miles away, carried or dragged or floated on rafts, their movement a feat of organization and determination, and the sarsen stones from closer quarries, each weighing 25 tons or more, shaped with stone hammers into precise forms, erected into linteled circles that encoded astronomical alignments. What drove such efforts? Such devotion of resources to monuments that produced no food, no shelter, no immediate material benefit, can only be understood through the lens of meaning and identity, through the human need for connection to ancestors and cosmos, for marking the land as culturally significant, as home. In Northern Europe, the late Neolithic saw the emergence of new pottery traditions, the corded ware culture spreading across a vast region from the Rhine to the Volga, their distinctive vessels decorated with impressions from twisted cord, their burial practices including individual graves with specific gender-associated goods, battle axes for men, amber ornaments for women, and the bell beaker culture appearing around 4,600 years ago, their characteristic drinking vessels found across Western and Central Europe, from Britain to Sicily, from Portugal to Hungary, suggesting far-flung networks of exchange and possibly migration, possibly the spread of a particular social identity or belief system. These late Neolithic cultures existed at the threshold of the Bronze Age, some groups already working metal, others still fully stone-using, the boundaries between periods blurred and overlapping, the transformation happening at different rates in different places. Trade became increasingly important. Amber from the Baltic, obsidian from Anatolia, jade from the Alps, tin from Cornwall and Brittany, each material moving along routes that connected distant communities, creating dependencies and relationships that transcended local economies. With trade came the possibility of wealth accumulation, some individuals or families controlling access to valued goods, using trade connections to enhance their status, beginning the process of social differentiation that would lead to hereditary inequality, to chiefs and commoners, to the hierarchical societies that would characterize later ages. The late Neolithic also saw increased evidence of conflict, fortified settlements becoming more common, weapons more prevalent in burials, mass graves with trauma indicating warfare, suggesting that competition for resources and territory intensified as populations grew and prime agricultural land became scarce. The lake dwellings of Alpine Europe, built on platforms over water, partially reflect this need for defensible positions, though they also took advantage of lacustrine resources, fish and waterfowl, reeds for thatch and weaving, the particular affordances of wetland environments. These settlements preserve organic materials that normally decay, wooden tools and textiles, basketry and rope, leather and plant remains, offering glimpses of the full material culture that is usually lost, showing the sophistication and skill of Neolithic craftspeople in perishable media, the textiles especially, woven on simple looms from flax and wool, demonstrate aesthetic sensibilities and technical competence. Cloth of different weights and weaves, some plain, some with patterns created through variation in thread color or weaving technique, garments tailored to fit, decorated with embroidery or applique. Food processing had become highly developed, grinding stones of various types for different grains, sieves for separating flour from bran, fermentation of grain into beer, milk into cheese and yogurt, transforming raw materials into more digestible, more storable, more varied forms. The cuisine of the late Neolithic was not simple or monotonous. Archaeological evidence and experimental archaeology suggest bread of various types, porridges and gruels, stews combining meat and vegetables and grain, dairy products, both fresh and preserved, fruits fresh and dried, honey for sweetening, herbs for flavor and medicine. Meals were social events, families gathering around hearths, communities feasting on special occasions, the sharing of food reinforcing bonds and obligations, creating the social fabric that held settlements together, that maintained cooperation in the face of individual self-interest. Houses themselves had evolved from the simple circular or oval structures of the early Neolithic, in many regions becoming larger, more rectangular, divided into rooms with specialized functions, storage areas separate from living areas, workspaces distinct from sleeping quarters. Some late Neolithic houses show evidence of second stories, sleeping lofts, or storage areas above the main floor, making more efficient use of space, accommodating growing families within existing settlements rather than always expanding outward. The construction techniques had grown sophisticated, timber framing with wattle and daub infill, thatched roofs carefully laid to shed water, plastered walls painted white or in colors, floors of packed earth or clay or sometimes wood planks. Each culture developing its own architectural tradition adapted to local materials and climate. In the Near East and Anatolia, mud brick remained the primary building material, walls thick enough to insulate against summer heat and winter cold, flat roofs that could serve as additional living space in warm weather, courtyards that brought light and air into the center of tightly packed settlements. The late Neolithic saw the full development of the domestic sphere as a distinct cultural realm, households as economic units, as centers of production and consumption, as the basic building blocks of community organization, the foundation upon which all larger social structures rested. Religion had become increasingly institutionalized, shrines and temples built for communal ritual, priesthoods emerging as specialized roles, religious practice moving beyond household and clan to become a focus of settlement, wide identity, and coordination. The great temples of Malta, built between 5,800 and 4,000 years ago, massive stone structures with elaborate facades and interior chambers, decorated with spiral carvings and representational art, demonstrate the capacity of Neolithic communities to organize labor for religious purposes, to create lasting monuments to their beliefs. Female figurines, common throughout the Neolithic, suggest the importance of fertility and regeneration in religious thought, though interpretation remains contested. Some seeing goddess worship, others seeing generic symbols of abundance, others cautioning against imposing modern categories on ancient beliefs. Burial practices grew more elaborate, particularly for certain individuals, suggesting emerging social hierarchies. Though the late Neolithic generally remained more egalitarian than the Bronze Age societies that would follow, wealth differences visible but not yet crystallized into permanent class divisions. Secondary burial became common in some cultures, bodies allowed to decay, then bones gathered and reburied collectively, creating a connection between living and dead that emphasized community continuity, lineage and belonging extending beyond individual lives into the realm of ancestors. Around 4,000 years ago, across much of the Old World, the Neolithic began its final transition into the Bronze Age proper, though this was less a sharp break than a gradual shift, bronze tools and weapons slowly replacing stone. Urban centers growing larger and more complex, writing spreading beyond the earliest centers, long-distance trade intensifying. But in defining what the Neolithic was, it is not the endpoint that matters most. It is the entirety of the transformation, the slow, patient accumulation of knowledge and practice that remade human life, that created the foundation for everything that followed. For thousands of years, humans had domesticated plants and animals, had settled into permanent communities, had developed pottery and weaving and complex tool kits, had built monuments and elaborated rituals, had increased their numbers from millions to tens of millions across the globe. They had changed the landscape profoundly, clearing forests, creating fields, building settlements, diverting water, their presence visible from a distance in ways forager camps never were, the earth itself bearing the marks of human intention and labor. And they had changed themselves, their bodies adapting to new diets, developing lactose tolerance in populations that herded dairy animals, changing in stature and robustness as nutrition and disease patterns shifted, their brains reorganized by literacy in the places where writing emerged. The pace of change had accelerated beyond anything evolution had prepared humans for, biological adaptation proceeding on timescales of thousands of generations, cultural evolution now happening within single lifetimes, the gap between the two creating tensions and mismatches that persist to the present day. The Neolithic was not just a technological revolution, though it was certainly that. It was a revolution in human consciousness, in the way people understood their place in the world, in their relationship to time itself before agriculture. Human planning horizons extended perhaps a season, maybe a year, decisions made in response to immediate conditions, movements timed to the predictable migrations of animals and the ripening of wild plants. A life lived in the eternal present of ecological rhythms. But farming required forethought on an entirely different scale. Seeds saved from one harvest would not yield food until the next year. Decisions about where to plant and what to plant committed land and labor months in advance. Investments in clearing and soil preparation that might not pay off for years. This extended temporal awareness, this need to imagine future states and work toward them systematically, fundamentally altered human cognition, creating minds that could plan, that could delay gratification, that could coordinate complex sequences of action toward distant goals. The psychological impact of this shift ripples through every aspect of Neolithic life, visible in the monuments that required generations to complete, in the burial practices that emphasized lineage and continuity, in the development of property concepts tied to specific places, to fields and orchards that represented accumulated labor across time. Ownership itself took on new meaning when a family invested years in improving a plot of land, clearing stones, amending soil, planting fruit trees that would not bear for years. That land became identified with them in ways that hunting territories never had. It became inheritance, something to pass to children, something worth defending. And with ownership came anxiety, the fear of loss that haunts all agricultural peoples, the knowledge that a bad season could mean starvation, that pests or disease could destroy months of work in days, that conflict could dispossess a family of everything they had built. This anxiety drove innovation, the development of storage techniques to buffer against shortage, the formation of alliances and exchange networks to provide insurance, the elaboration of religious practices seeking to influence the forces that controlled fertility and weather, attempts to impose order on a world that remained fundamentally uncertain, the relationship to nature transformed. Foragers lived within ecosystems, taking what was offered, moving on when local resources declined, their impact real but diffuse, their presence part of the natural balance rather than a force disrupting it. Farmers worked against natural succession, clearing land and keeping it clear, preventing the return of forest, creating and maintaining artificial ecosystems that existed only through constant labor, imposing human will on the landscape in an ongoing struggle against entropy. This was not harmony with nature, though it was not yet the wholesale domination that would come with industrialization. It was negotiation, collaboration, a relationship both creative and extractive, building soil fertility while depleting it, protecting favored species while eliminating competitors, shaping nature while being shaped by its constraints. The plants and animals of the Neolithic became something between wild and artifice, domesticates that could not survive without human care, that existed in forms nature alone would never have created, yet still living things with their own needs and tendencies, partners rather than products, though the line between partnership and exploitation was always blurred. In the quiet of evening, when the work was done and fires burned low, Neolithic people must have contemplated the strangeness of their lives, the way they had bound themselves to place and plant, the way their ancestors' way of life had slipped away like water through cupped hands? Did they recognize the magnitude of what was happening? Did they see themselves as revolutionaries? Or did it all feel inevitable, each small change leading naturally to the next, the pattern only visible in retrospect from the vantage point of those who would come after? The stories they told are lost, their songs silent, their fears and hopes and dreams accessible only through the mute testimony of objects and structures, through the patterns archaeologists discern in the scatter of ancient seeds and the layout of vanished villages. But we can imagine, must imagine, the interior lives of these people who were as human as we are, who loved and grieved, who watched their children grow and worried for their futures, who found meaning in their work and their communities, who created beauty not from necessity but from the sheer human need to make meaning. The decorated pottery, the carved figurines, the painted walls and elaborate burials all speak to this need, to the impulse to transform the material world into something more than functional, to embed it with significance, to make it reflect the inner landscape of thought and feeling, and in doing so, in creating permanence and investing place with meaning, in building structures that would outlast individual lives. They were also creating history, creating a record that could be read, creating the possibility of connection across time. The light shifts again, as it always does, as it did in that ancient world, and as it does now, the long arc of the day bending toward evening, toward the soft dissolution of forms into shadow. I find myself standing at the edge of all those vanished fields, all those settlements that have returned to earth, trying to feel the weight of what happened here, the slow, patient work of 10,000 years of human hands shaping the world. The wind moves through grasses that may or may not be descended from those first cultivated stands. The distinction between wild and domestic long since blurred by millennia of cross-pollination and selection, by the constant exchange between human intention and natural process. Somewhere beneath my feet, if I could dig deep enough past the accumulated sediments of centuries, I might find a grinding stone, a flint blade, a shard of pottery whose maker has been dust for 5,000 years, each object a point of contact with lives fully lived and completely vanished. The Neolithic left us more than artifacts. It left us the fundamental structure of human civilization, the agricultural foundation on which everything else was built, the sedentary lifestyle that made cities possible, the surplus production that freed some people to specialize, to create art and architecture and eventually literature and science. Every loaf of bread, every domestic animal, every woven cloth, every brick building, every concept of property and inheritance and settlement traces its lineage back to those first tentative experiments in the Fertile Crescent and the other centers of agricultural origin. We are still, in many ways, Neolithic people, our bodies and brains shaped by the 10,000 years of agricultural life more than by the brief industrial centuries. Our deepest instincts about family and territory and resource management forged in that long transformation, the anxieties that haunt modern life, the fear of scarcity, the drive to accumulate and pass on, the tendency to see nature as something to be managed rather than joined. These, too, are inheritances from the Neolithic. psychological adaptations to a way of life that created new opportunities and new terrors in equal measure. But so too is the capacity for patience, for long-term planning, for cooperation on scales beyond the immediate band, for creating beauty and meaning in everyday objects, for imagining futures and working toward them, for binding ourselves to place and community with ties that transcend individual survival. The evening deepens, stars beginning to appear in the darkening vault above. The same stars that guided Neolithic farmers in their planting, that marked the seasons in their endless turning, that connected Earth to cosmos in patterns both useful and sacred. I think of all the seeds planted and harvested across all those generations, each one a small act of faith, a belief that the future would come, that work done today would yield returns tomorrow or next season or next year, that the world would continue in its patterns, that children would inherit what parents had built. And mostly they did. Mostly the rains came and the seeds sprouted and the animals bred and the children grew. Not always, not without loss and grief and failure, but enough to sustain the experiment, enough to carry it forward into the next generation and the next, until it became not an experiment, but simply the way things were, the only way anyone could remember. The old wandering life, a story told by grandparents who heard it from their grandparents, a legend of a time before time when people moved with the animals and lived by the gifts of the wild earth. The Neolithic is over now, long over, succeeded by bronze and iron, by empires and religions, by technologies and transformations those first farmers could never have imagined. Yet it remains present in every bite we eat, every roof over our heads, every settlement from village to metropolis. It is the foundation, the bedrock, the deep past that made the present possible. And in quiet moments, when the modern world falls away and we find ourselves standing in evening light, watching the land settle into shadow, we might still feel its presence, still sense the slow, patient work of those ancient hands in every cultivated field, every domestic creature, every human dwelling on the face of the earth. The darkness gathers gently, softly, without urgency, and the Neolithic world fades into the long dream of history, its people gone, but not entirely lost, living on in us, in the fundamental patterns of our lives, in the deep structures of civilization, in the seeds we still plant each spring, hoping for harvest, trusting in continuity, believing in the future they first learned to imagine so long ago. The stars wheel overhead, patient and eternal, marking time as they always have, as they did for the first person who ever deliberately placed a seed in the earth and waited. And we are all the children of that waiting, that faith, that quiet revolution that changed everything, and the world settles into stillness, into the peace of completion, into the gentle fade of all stories told, all transformations remembered, all the quiet work of human hands across the ages, finding rest at last in memory, in the soft dark, in the endless turning of seasons that continues still, continues always, continues. I want to take you somewhere quiet tonight, somewhere ancient, somewhere that exists in the space between knowing and wondering, a place where the story of everything begins. Imagine standing at the edge of an ocean, not the ocean as we know it today, but an ocean from a time so distant that the very air above it would be unbreathable to us now. The sky stretches in shades we might not recognize, perhaps tinged with orange, perhaps heavy with methane and ammonia, and the water beneath moves in slow, eternal rhythms. This is Earth, but Earth before it knew what it would become. Earth in its infancy, wrapped in storms and silence, bathed in starlight and the glow of a younger sun. The rocks along this ancient shore are warm, heated from within by a planet still settling into itself, still cooling from its violent birth. And if we could kneel down and place our hand against the stone, we would feel the pulse of a world in the process of becoming, a world where chemistry and physics are engaged in a slow, patient dance. There are no footprints here, no voices, no eyes to witness what unfolds in these shallow pools and deep ocean vents. And yet, something is stirring, something is beginning, something so small and so profound that it will reshape every surface, every atmosphere, every possibility this world holds. In the warm water, in the spaces between mineral and liquid, in the meeting places of energy and matter, molecules are finding each other, bumping and bonding, breaking apart and reforming over and over across millions of years with a patience that defies imagination. These are not living things, not yet, but they are the whispers of life, the chemical sentences that will one day learn to copy themselves, to protect themselves, to respond to their surroundings. They are floating in solution, drifting in tidal pools, gathering near hydrothermal vents where the Earth's heat meets the ocean's cold, and somewhere, in some particular pool, in some particular moment, lost to time, something happens. A molecule assembles itself in just the right way, with just the right components, and it does something remarkable. It makes a copy of itself, not perfectly, not elegantly, but it happens. And that copy, surrounded by the same building blocks, makes another copy, and another. This is not consciousness, not intention, not desire. It is chemistry finding a new path, but it is also the moment when the universe begins to know itself from the inside, when matter becomes organized in such a way that it can persist, can adapt, can change. The ocean holds this secret gently, rocking it in currents, protecting it in the dark, and time moves forward, not in days or years, but in epochs, in ages measured by the slow drift of continents and the patient wearing down of mountains. The early replicators are fragile. Most fail. Most dissolve back into the chemical soup from which they emerged. But some, by pure chance, by the mathematics of probability played out across billions of attempts, some persist. Some find themselves wrapped in protective membranes. Some develop ways to harvest energy from their surroundings, to break down other molecules and use their components. And the Earth, patient and vast, continues its rotation, continues its journey around the sun. Seasons that are not yet seasons pass. Tides that follow the pull of a closer moon rise and fall. And in the water, in the thin films on rocks, in the warm springs and cold depths, life is learning what it means to be alive. This is where our story truly begins, in these forgotten waters, under these unfamiliar skies, with organisms so simple they barely qualify as organisms at all, and yet they carry within them every future forest, every creature that will ever swim or fly or walk, every human thought and dream. The narrative unfolds slowly, because that is how it happened, because the Earth measured time differently then, Because 4 billion years ago there was no rush, only the steady accumulation of small changes, only the endless experiment of existence trying every possible variation. The first cells, if we can even call them that, are nothing like the cells we know today. They are barely more than bubbles, membranes of lipids that happen to form spheres in water, trapping inside them the replicating molecules that would become the first genetic material. And these bubbles drift, merge, break apart, reform. Inside each one, a kind of chaos reigns, but it is organized chaos. Chemistry constrained by the walls of the membrane. Reactions happening in sequence, in patterns that begin to repeat. And with each repetition, with each generation, there is the possibility of variation, of mistake, of accident that becomes advantage. The early ocean is not empty. It is rich with dissolved minerals, with carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, with sulfur rising from volcanic vents, with iron that colors the water in rusty plumes, and the first living things, these protocells, these experiments in persistence. They feed on this abundance. They absorb molecules through their membranes. They break chemical bonds and harvest the energy released. Time passes, perhaps 100 million years, perhaps 200 million. The numbers are so vast they lose meaning. But what matters is that life, fragile and simple as it is, survives. It survives meteor impacts that boil the oceans. It survives ice ages that lock the surface in frost. It survives because it is small, because it is distributed across the entire planet, because extinction of one population means nothing when a billion others persist in distant pools and vents. And then, slowly, inevitably, life discovers something transformative. Some ancient ancestor, some bacterial pioneer, develops a way to capture energy not from breaking down existing molecules, but from light itself. This is photosynthesis in its earliest form, crude and inefficient, but revolutionary. Suddenly life is not dependent solely on the chemical wealth of the planet. It can tap into the endless stream of energy pouring down from the sun. And with this breakthrough, everything changes. The photosynthesizers multiply. They spread across the surface waters. They form mats and films, and as they work, as they split water molecules to harvest electrons, they release something into the atmosphere as waste, oxygen. At first, this oxygen is absorbed immediately. It rusts iron in the oceans. It oxidizes sulfur and methane. For hundreds of millions of years, the oxygen produced by these early organisms never accumulates. It is consumed by the chemistry of a planet that has never known it. But life is persistent and productive, and eventually, after eons of continuous production, the sinks are saturated, the iron has rusted, the reactive gases have been oxidized, and oxygen, toxic to most of the life that exists, begins to build up in the atmosphere. This is the great oxidation event. Though event is perhaps the wrong word, it unfolds over tens of millions of years, maybe longer, but it transforms the planet utterly. The sky changes color, the chemistry of the ocean shifts, and countless species of bacteria, adapted to a world without oxygen, retreat to the deep, to the mud, to the dark places where oxygen cannot reach. But some organisms, through chance or mutation or the simple mathematics of variation, some can tolerate oxygen, and a few, through accidents of cellular architecture, discover they can use it. They can burn fuel with oxygen and extract far more energy than any previous metabolism could manage. This is respiration, aerobic respiration, and it is so efficient, so powerful, that it enables entirely new forms of complexity. Cells can grow larger, can do more, can support more elaborate internal structures. And here, in this oxygenated world, another crucial development unfolds. One cell, perhaps weakened, perhaps damaged, is engulfed by another, but instead of being digested, instead of being destroyed, it survives inside its host, and it continues to function, continues to produce energy. This is endosymbiosis, the merger that will create the eukaryotic cell, the complex cell with internal compartments and specialized structures, the cell that will eventually give rise to all plants, all animals, all fungi, all the visible life we know. The engulfed cell becomes the mitochondrion, the powerhouse, forever linked to its host, dividing when the host divides, carrying its own small loop of DNA that remembers its bacterial origins. And in plant ancestors, another engulfment occurs, a photosynthetic bacterium taken in, becoming the chloroplast, the green engine that will one day power forests and prairies and the microscopic meadows of the sea. These early eukaryotes, these composite organisms, are still single cells, still microscopic, but they are more complex than anything that came before. They have internal skeletons of protein. They have membrane-wrapped nuclei protecting their genetic material. They have the machinery to do things bacteria never could. And they begin to experiment with something extraordinary. They begin to communicate, to stick together, to form colonies where cells specialize, where some cells take on the task of gathering food while others focus on reproduction, where the whole becomes something different from the sum of its parts. This is the slow, tentative beginning of multicellularity, and it happens not once but multiple times, independently, across different lineages, because the advantages are profound. A colony can be larger, can access resources that single cells cannot, can survive predation that would destroy individuals. The ocean floor, perhaps 1 billion years after life began, is covered in these experiments in mats of bacteria and archaea, in films of early algae, in small colonies of cells that cling to rocks and to each other. And among them move the first predators, single-celled hunters that engulf others, that have turned the abundance of life into a food source. This predation drives innovation. Cells develop walls and armor. They produce toxins. They learn to move faster, to sense their environment, to flee or fight, and the dance of evolution accelerates, no longer driven solely by chemistry and climate, but by the interactions of living things with each other. Somewhere in these ancient seas, perhaps in a quiet lagoon, perhaps in the deep, the first truly multicellular organism takes shape. It is soft-bodied, simple, perhaps just a ball of cells, or a sheet, or a simple tube, but it is coordinated. Its cells work together in ways that matter, that make survival more likely. The fossil record from this time is sparse. Soft bodies rarely preserve, but occasionally, in rocks from the right age, in formations where sediment was fine and conditions were perfect, we find impressions, shadows, suggestions of forms that are neither bacterial mats nor anything we would recognize today, strange quilted shapes, fronds and discs, organisms that seem to belong to no modern group, the Ediacaran biota, life's first large-scale experiment with size and form. These creatures live in a world still governed by slowness, still measured in the patient accumulation of sediment and the gradual drift of continents. The days are shorter then, the moon is closer, the tides stronger, and in the water, life is building the toolkit it will need for everything that follows. Cells learn to make collagen, the structural protein that will support bodies. They develop the ability to precipitate calcium carbonate to build shells and skeletons. They evolve muscles and nerves, the capacity for movement and coordination beyond anything the single cells could achieve. And then, around 540 million years ago, something remarkable happens. The pace of innovation explodes in a geological instant, in perhaps 10 or 20 million years, a blink in the history of life. Most of the major body plans we know today appear in the fossil record. This is the Cambrian explosion. Though, again, explosion is relative, it is still slow by our standards, still unfolding over millions of years, but compared to the billions that came before, it is sudden, dramatic, transformative. The oceans fill with arthropods in armor, with worms that burrow and swim, with early mollusks and echinoderms, with creatures that have eyes, real eyes, that can see predators and prey, that can navigate a visual world. And this innovation, vision, drives yet another acceleration, because now hunting and hiding become sophisticated. Now evolution has immediate feedback. Now the stakes of every encounter are written in the survival of lineages. The Cambrian seas are alien and familiar at once. The water is clear in some places, murky with life in others. The creatures are small by modern standards, many just centimeters long, but they are diverse. They are specialized. They are filling niches and creating new ones by their very existence. And among them, swimming in these ancient waters, are the first chordates, creatures with a notochord, a flexible rod running the length of their body, the precursor to a spine. They are unremarkable at first, just small filter feeders, but they carry within their simple bodies the blueprint for fish, for amphibians, for everything with a backbone. The continents during this time are scattered. Most life is in the sea. The land is barren, perhaps dotted with bacterial mats near water, perhaps colored by lichens, but empty of plants, empty of animals, still waiting for the innovations that will allow life to leave the water behind. But in the water, life is perfecting the architecture of survival. Fish evolve jaws, transforming from passive filter feeders into active hunters. Cartilage hardens into bone, giving structure and strength. Fins become more sophisticated, allowing precise movement through three-dimensional space. The ocean itself is stratified, layered, with different temperatures and chemistries at different depths, and life adapts to each layer, each niche. Some fish hug the bottom, armored and slow, sifting through sediment for food. Others cruise the open water, sleek and fast, pursuing prey that dart and wheel in silver schools. And beneath it all, covering the seafloor in many places, are the reefs, not coral reefs yet, but reefs built by other organisms, by stromatoporoids and archaeocyathids, by creatures that secrete limestone and build upward towards the light, creating three-dimensional habitats, forests of stone where countless smaller organisms shelter and feed. Time continues its patient march. 50 million years pass. 100 million, the continents drift and collide. Mountains rise where ocean floor buckles and folds, and in the shallows, near the margins of the land. Plants are making their first tentative experiments with air. The ancestors of land plants are green algae living in freshwater pools and streams, already adapted to variable conditions, to periods of drying, to exposure to intense sunlight, and some, through gradual modification, develop structures that can resist desiccation, waxy coatings that hold moisture in, simple root-like structures that anchor them and draw up water. The first land plants are tiny, low-growing, perhaps resembling modern liverworts or mosses. They have no true roots, no leaves, no flowers, but they can survive out of water, and that is enough. They spread along riverbanks, across damp lowlands, creating the first hint of a green on landscapes that have been gray and brown and red since the planet formed. And as plants colonize the land, they begin to change it. Their roots, simple as they are, break down rock, create the first true soils. When they die, their bodies decompose, adding organic matter to the mineral substrate, and slowly, very slowly, the land becomes hospitable to other life. Arthropods follow the plants, millipedes and primitive insects, creatures already adapted to life in armor, to breathing air through spiracles, to moving on legs rather than swimming. They feed on the plants, on the decaying matter, on each other, and they thrive, growing larger in an atmosphere that now holds more oxygen than ever before. The oxygen content rises, pushed higher by the expanding forests of plants, by ferns that grow tall as trees, by club mosses that tower overhead. And in this oxygen-rich air, insects can grow to sizes that seem impossible by today's standards. Dragonflies with wingspans measured in feet, millipedes as long as a human is tall. A world where invertebrates are the giants. And still the story is unfolding in the water, because that is where the vertebrates are perfecting their form. Fish develop lungs as well as gills, organs that allow them to gulp air when water becomes stagnant, when oxygen levels drop. And these lungs, these backup breathing systems, become the key to the next great transition. Some fish begin to use their fleshy fins, their lobed appendages, to push through shallow water, to move from pond to pond when rivers run dry, and generation by generation, these fins become more robust, more jointed, more leg-like, the bones within them separating, articulating, becoming the foundations of ankles and wrists and digits. Around 370 million years ago, one of these fish, one of these lobe-finned pioneers, pulls itself onto land and breathes and survives and returns to the water, but its descendants will make the journey again and again until some stay on land, until some adapt so fully to terrestrial life that they never return except to breed. These are the first amphibians, and they are strange by our standards. Salamander-like, but heavier, with thick skulls and sprawling legs, with skin that must stay moist, with eggs that must be laid in water. They are transitional, caught between two worlds, but successful nonetheless. The late Carboniferous period, around 300 million years ago, is a time of swamps and forests, of vast wetlands that stretch across the tropical zones. And in these swamps grow the tree ferns and club mosses, creating dense canopies, filtering the sunlight into green-tinted dimness. And on the forest floor, in the shallow water, the amphibians hunt and breed, When these forests die, when they topple and sink into the swamp water, they do not fully decay. The water is too acidic, too poor in oxygen, and instead they are buried, compressed, transformed over millions of years into the coal seams that will one day power human industry. But that future is unimaginably distant. For now, there is only the slow accumulation, the patient burial of carbon, and among the amphibians, some lineages are evolving a crucial innovation, the amniotic egg, an egg with a protective shell and internal membranes that hold water and nutrients, an egg that can be laid on land, away from predators that lurk in ponds, away from the competition and danger of the water. This development, this seemingly simple change in reproductive strategy, unlocks the land completely. The first reptiles appear, small and lizard-like, but fully terrestrial, able to live their entire lives away from water, and they diversify rapidly, spreading into the uplands, into the drier regions, into niches that amphibians could never fully exploit. The climate shifts, the continents continue their drift, the great swamps begin to dry, and the age of reptiles truly begins. They evolve into countless forms. Some return to the water, becoming aquatic hunters. Some take to the air on membranous wings. Some grow to enormous size, developing upright postures, efficient metabolisms, becoming the dominant large animals on land. But before the dinosaurs, before the iconic giants that will capture human imagination, there are other dynasties, other experiments in reptilian form, the synapsids, the mammal-like reptiles, with skulls that show the beginnings of differentiated teeth, with legs that move more beneath the body than to the sides, with hints of warmer blood and more active lifestyles. These creatures dominate the Permian period, the last chapter of the Paleozoic era. They range from small insectivores to massive herbivores, from swift predators to lumbering giants, and they are successful, widespread, diverse, ruling an Earth that is assembling itself into a single supercontinent, Pangaea, where all the land masses have collided into one tremendous whole. And then, around 252 million years ago, disaster strikes, the worst extinction event in Earth's history, the Great Dying, perhaps triggered by massive volcanic eruptions, perhaps by the release of methane from the seafloor, perhaps by a combination of catastrophes that create a cascade of climate chaos. The oceans become acidic, oxygen levels plummet, temperatures spike, and life, diverse and abundant, is reduced to remnants. Over 90% of marine species vanish. Over 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. Entire ecosystems collapse, leaving behind a planet that seems empty, scarred, struggling. But life, as always, persists in small populations, in refugia, in the forms that happen to have the right adaptations for survival. And from these survivors, from these lucky or well-adapted few, the world will be repopulated. And among the survivors are the archosaurs, the ruling reptiles, ancestors of dinosaurs and crocodiles and birds. The Triassic period begins in the aftermath, in a world recovering, recolonizing, and the early dinosaurs appear, small at first, bipedal, quick, competing with other archosaurs, with the remaining synapsids, with the ancestors of modern crocodiles, but they have advantages, efficient breathing systems, upright postures that allow sustained activity, and they begin to dominate. By the Jurassic, dinosaurs have diversified into every terrestrial niche. Long-necked sauropods that browse the treetops, weighing dozens of tons, supported by columnar legs and air-filled bones that reduce their mass, theropods that hunt, from small feathered forms to massive apex predators with bone-crushing jaws, ornithischians that evolve elaborate defenses, plates and spikes and horns and armor, and in the trees, among the branches of the conifers and cycads that dominate the Mesozoic forests, small creatures are hiding, the mammals, descendants of the synapsids, reduced by the rise of dinosaurs to marginal existence, to nocturnal hunting, to lives spent in burrows and shadows. But they are adapting, developing acute hearing, sensitive whiskers, warm blood that allows activity in the cool of night, and fur, insulation that makes their warm-bloodedness efficient. The Mesozoic unfolds, the Jurassic gives way to the Cretaceous, flowering plants appear, angiosperms with their co-evolution with insects, with their efficient reproduction and rapid growth, and they transform the landscape, creating new opportunities, new food sources, and the dinosaurs adapt to this new flora. Duck-billed hadrosaurs with batteries of grinding teeth, ceratopsians with beaks and jaws designed for cropping tough vegetation. And among the theropods, some lineages are becoming more and more bird-like, developing feathers for insulation, for display, and eventually for flight, reducing in size, modifying their forelimbs into wings, their skeletons becoming lighter, hollow, and by the middle, Cretaceous, true birds are flying, small and toothed still, but unmistakably avian, sharing the skies with the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that have ruled the air for 100 million years. The world of the late Cretaceous is warm, tropical, lush. The seas are high, flooding the continents, creating shallow seaways where marine reptiles hunt, mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. The land is divided by these seas, creating isolated populations, driving speciation, and life is abundant, diverse, seemingly secure in its established patterns. But 66 million years ago, another catastrophe arrives. An asteroid, 6 miles wide, strikes the Yucatan Peninsula, and the impact releases energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons, vaporizing rock, creating a crater over 100 miles across, sending debris into the atmosphere that will circle the globe, blocking sunlight, causing temperatures to plummet. The fires that follow sweep across continents, consuming forests that have stood for millions of years. The ash rises, mixes with the vaporized rock, creates a darkness that lasts for months, perhaps years, and in that darkness, photosynthesis stops, plants die, herbivores starve, and the predators that depend on them follow. The extinction is not immediate, not universal, but it is devastating. The non-avian dinosaurs, successful for over 160 million years, vanish. The pterosaurs, the mosasaurs, the ammonites that filled the seas, countless species of plants and smaller animals, all gone, removed from the story, their lineages ending in ash and cold and starvation, but some survive. The birds, small enough to subsist on seeds and insects, the mammals, sheltered in burrows, able to lower their metabolism and endure, crocodilians and turtles, cold-blooded and capable of long fasts. And from these survivors, from these creatures that happen to have the right adaptations at the right moment, the world will be rebuilt once more. The Paleocene epoch dawns in a diminished world. Ecosystems are simplified. Forests are reduced to ferns and small plants, the first growth after catastrophe, but life, persistent as always, begins to recover. Mammals emerge from their refugia and find a world without dinosaurs, without the dominant predators and megaherbivores, a world of opportunity. They diversify rapidly. Within 10 million years, within the blink of geological time, mammals have evolved into forms that fill the niches left empty. Some become browsers, developing specialized teeth for grinding plants. Some become predators, evolving sharp carnassial teeth and keen senses. Some take to the water, their limbs modifying into flippers, their bodies becoming streamlined for swimming. And some take to the trees, the primates, developing grasping hands and forward-facing eyes, depth perception that allows them to judge distances between branches, and in the forests that are regrowing, that are becoming complex and layered again, these tree dwellers thrive, eating fruits and insects, flowers and leaves, and their brains grow larger to process the three-dimensional world of the canopy. The earth itself continues to change. India collides with Asia, pushing up the Himalayas. The Atlantic widens. South America separates from Antarctica, and these movements create new climate patterns, new ocean currents, new distributions of rain and temperature, and life responds, adapting to each change, diversifying into the newly created environments. Grasses evolve, spreading across the continents as the climate becomes drier, cooler, and they create a new biome, the grasslands, vast open spaces where trees cannot compete, where fire and grazing maintain the openness, and new herbivores evolve to exploit this resource. Horses losing their side toes, developing single hooves for running, elephants growing larger, developing trunks to gather the low vegetation, and predators follow, cats with retractable claws and explosive speed, wolves that hunt in coordinated packs. In the oceans, whales evolve from land-dwelling ancestors, returning to the sea, their front legs becoming flippers, their hind legs disappearing entirely, their nostrils migrating to the tops of their heads, and they grow to sizes that rival the largest dinosaurs, filter feeding on the abundance of krill and small fish, or hunting with echolocation in the dark depths. And in Africa, in the forests and the spreading savannas, the primates are continuing their own evolution. Some lineages remain in the trees, but others, as the forests fragment, begin to spend more time on the ground, walking on all fours, their hands still adapted for grasping, but their posture changing, their lifestyle adapting to a more terrestrial existence. Around 7 million years ago, one lineage makes a crucial shift, beginning to walk upright more consistently. Bipedalism, freeing the hands, allowing them to carry things, to use tools, to manipulate the environment in new ways, and the advantages compound. Upright posture allows better vision over tall grass, more efficient long-distance travel, the ability to carry food back to a central location. These early hominins are still ape-like in many ways, small-brained, living in social groups, eating fruits and leaves, but they are experimenting with a new mode of existence, and over the next several million years, they diversify, multiple species walking upright, spreading across Africa, adapting to different environments. The climate continues to oscillate. Ice ages come and go. Glaciers advance and retreat. Sea levels rise and fall. And these changes create pressures, challenges that drive innovation. Some hominin lineages go extinct, unable to adapt, but others persist, and among them, brain size begins to increase, slowly at first, then more rapidly. Around 2.5 million years ago, the first stone tools appear, simple flakes knocked off larger stones, sharp edges for cutting meat, for processing plant materials, and this technology, crude as it is, marks a threshold, the deliberate modification of the environment, the extension of capability beyond what biology alone provides. The genus Homo emerges taller, more graceful, with brains larger than their ancestors, and they spread, moving out of Africa in waves, following the coastlines, the river valleys, adapting to new climates, new food sources, and their tools become more sophisticated. Hand axes shaped with intention, fire controlled and maintained, used for warmth, for cooking, for defense, and somewhere in this process, perhaps gradually, perhaps through some threshold of neural complexity, consciousness as we know it emerges, self-awareness, the ability to think about thinking, to imagine future, to remember pasts, to create meaning and symbol and story. Language develops, not all at once, but through stages. Simple calls become more complex, begin to refer to things not immediately present, begin to combine in structured ways. Syntax emerges, grammar, and suddenly information can be transmitted with precision. Experience can be shared, knowledge can accumulate across generations. Different species of Homo coexist. Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, Denisovans in the East, Homo erectus persisting in isolated pockets, and Homo sapiens, our own species, emerging in Africa around 300,000 years ago, slightly built, with high foreheads and prominent chins, and brains that are not larger than Neanderthals, but perhaps organized differently, perhaps more capable of symbolic thought, of abstraction. For most of their existence, Homo sapiens live as hunter-gatherers, in small bands, moving with the seasons, reading the landscape, knowing the plants and animals intimately, creating art, burying their dead with ceremony, making jewelry and music, living lives that are materially simple but cognitively rich. And then, around 12,000 years ago, in several places independently, some groups begin to settle, to plant seeds deliberately, to harvest and replant. Agriculture emerges not as a sudden revolution, but as a gradual intensification of practices that were already present, and it allows larger populations, permanent settlements, the accumulation of a surplus. With agriculture comes complexity, social stratification, specialization of labor, writing systems to track resources, cities built of mud brick and stone, civilizations that rise and fall, leaving behind temples and monuments, records in clay and papyrus, and the pace of change accelerates. Technology building on technology, ideas spreading and combining. The last few thousand years, the span of recorded history, is vanishingly brief compared to what came before, but in this moment, life has become capable of understanding its own history, of piecing together the story from fossils and DNA, from the rocks and the isotopes, from the patient work of observation and inference. And standing here at this particular point in the story, we can look back across the 4.5 billion years, across the slow chemistry of the early ocean, the first cells, the oxygenation of the atmosphere, the Cambrian explosion, the colonization of land, the age of dinosaurs, the rise of mammals, the emergence of thought itself, and see it all as one continuous narrative, one unbroken thread of causation and consequence, each stage building on what came before, each innovation opening new possibilities, each extinction creating space for new experiments, and the earth, patient and generous, providing the stage, the raw materials, the energy from the sun and the heat from within, supporting this extraordinary unfolding. The story is not finished. It continues in every organism alive today, in every seed that sprouts, every egg that hatches, every birth and death, the same processes that began in those ancient pools, still operating, still generating variation, still selecting for what works, still creating beauty and complexity from simple rules applied over vast stretches of time. And what is most remarkable, what deserves our quiet contemplation, is that none of this required intention, required design, required anything beyond matter and energy and the laws that govern their interaction. The universe, through purely physical processes, has assembled itself into configurations that can wonder about their own existence. The carbon in our bodies was forged in the cores of ancient stars. The iron in our blood from supernovae that exploded before the sun was born. The water we drink cycled through countless organisms, through clouds and oceans and ice, for billions of years before reaching our lips. We are made entirely of recycled stardust, arranged temporarily into patterns that think and feel and question. And the DNA that guides our development, that carries the instructions for building a human body, is nearly identical to the DNA in every other living thing. We share over 98% of our genes with chimpanzees, over 60% with fruit flies, nearly half with bananas, because we all descend from those same early replicators, those molecules that learned to copy themselves in ancient seas. Every cell in your body contains mitochondria, those ancient bacteria that were engulfed billions of years ago, still dividing independently, still carrying their own DNA, still producing the energy that powers thought and movement. You are not a single organism, but a colony, a community of trillions of cells and trillions more bacteria, all working in coordination, all descended from separate lineages that learned to cooperate. The eye you use to read these words evolved independently dozens of times in vertebrates and octopuses and insects and box jellyfish, each time building a similar structure from different starting points, because the physics of focusing light leaves only so many solutions, only so many ways to create an image, and evolution, blind and patient, finds them all eventually. And consciousness itself, this feeling of being someone, of experiencing the world from a particular perspective, emerges from the firing of neurons, from electrical and chemical signals passing between cells, from patterns of activity in networks of unimaginable complexity. The same matter that forms rocks and water, arranged differently, becomes aware. There is no moment when life began, no clear boundary between chemistry and biology, just a gradient of increasing complexity, just molecules that became better and better at persisting, at adapting, at responding to their environment, until somewhere along that continuum we agree to call them alive. And there is no moment when we became human, no first human born to non-human parents, just populations changing gradually, interbreeding and separating, adapting to local conditions, until looking back across enough time, we see that something new has emerged. But the boundaries are fuzzy, arbitrary, drawn by us for convenience rather than reflecting sharp transitions in nature. The story of life is written in languages we are still learning to read fully, in the sequences of DNA, in the ratios of isotopes in ancient rocks, in the shapes of fossils and the distributions of species, in the similarities of embryonic development and the structures of proteins, each line of evidence confirming and refining what the others suggest. And what they tell us is that we are kin to everything, that the tree of life has no separate branches, only divisions of a single trunk that reach back to that first replicator, that every organism alive today, every human and redwood and bacterium, represents an unbroken lineage of successful reproduction stretching back 4 billion years. Not a single ancestor in your line failed to reproduce before dying, not one across billions of generations. Think of the odds, the countless ways each generation could have failed, the predator that happened to strike elsewhere, the disease that claimed others but not your ancestor, the drought that ended just in time, the mate that was successfully courted, the luck and adaptation and sheer persistence required. And yet here we are, each of us the temporary embodiment of a lineage that succeeded again and again and again. The extinction events that punctuate the story, the catastrophes that seem like endings, were also beginnings. Without the asteroid impact, mammals might never have diversified beyond small nocturnal insectivores. Without the great dying, archosaurs might never have risen to dominance. Without the oxygenation crisis, complex life might never have evolved. Destruction creates opportunity. Catastrophe clears space for innovation, and the story continues now, in this moment, as cells divide and mutations occur, as populations adapt to changing climates, as species go extinct and new ones emerge. Evolution has not stopped. It cannot stop as long as there is life and variation and differential survival. We are living in the middle of the story, not at its conclusion, and what comes next is unwritten. Some lineages will end. Most will end. That is the nature of existence in a changing world. Over 99% of all species that ever lived are now extinct, their experiments concluded, their contributions absorbed into the lineages that succeeded them or simply lost. And that is not tragedy but process. The universe trying possibilities, keeping what works in the current moment, discarding the rest, and through it all, the earth abides, patient as ever, recycling its materials, driven by the heat of its core and the energy of the sun, creating the conditions for complexity, for chemistry that becomes biology, for matter that becomes mind. Continuing the experiment that began so long ago in waters we can barely imagine, we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. As the scientist Carl Sagan observed, we are the universe contemplating its own existence, matter arranged in such a way that it can wonder about matter, and in that wondering, in that capacity for awe and curiosity, perhaps we glimpse something of the profound strangeness and beauty of simply existing at all. The ancient ocean still moves within us, in the salt content of our blood, in the way our cells function in aqueous solution. We carry the sea inside our bodies. We carry the history of life in our DNA, in our embryonic development that echoes fish and reptile stages, in the structures of our brains that layer newer regions over ancient cores. And perhaps the deepest lesson, the quietest truth, is that there is no separation, no fundamental divide between us and the rest of existence. We are expressions of the same processes, temporary patterns in the flow of matter and energy, connected to everything that came before and everything that will come after. Part of an unbroken story that began with the first stars and continues in ways we cannot predict. The universe is not a stage on which life appears. It is the source of life, the creative process itself, constantly generating novelty, complexity, consciousness. From nothing more than the patient working out of simple rules across vast expanses of time and space. And so the story spirals back to where it began, to the quiet shore of an ancient ocean, to the warm water moving in eternal rhythms, to the chemistry that never stopped its patient experimentation. If we could stand there again on that early shore, with all that we now know, we would see nothing remarkable, no drama, no obvious significance, just water and rock and the slow accumulation of molecules in solution, just chemistry proceeding according to its laws, just matter being matter, and yet in that unremarkable scene, in those simple processes, lies everything that follows, every forest and ocean, every creature that ever lived, every thought that was ever thought, waiting in the mathematics of possibility, ready to unfold, given time enough and conditions favorable. The night sky above that ancient ocean holds stars we would not recognize. The constellations have shifted. The galaxy has rotated several times since then, but the light still falls, steady and patient, providing energy, driving the great cycles of evaporation and weather, warming the surface where chemistry is most active, and in the water, invisible to any eye, the future is assembling itself, molecule by molecule, trial by trial, with no hurry and no goal, just the endless iteration of possibility, the universe exploring what it can become when matter organizes itself in new ways. The waves continue their ancient rhythm, rolling in, drawing back, carrying minerals and organic compounds, mixing the solution, providing the motion that brings molecules together, and time stretches forward, unmeasured and immeasurable, because there is no one to measure it, nothing yet that experiences duration, only the eternal present of chemical reaction, perhaps somewhere in those waves, in some particular moment we can never identify. A molecule copies itself, and the long story truly begins, or perhaps it has begun already, perhaps in scattered pools and vents across the planet, the same innovation occurring independently, repeatedly, the universe finding the same solution again and again because the chemistry allows only so many paths. Either way, the result will be the same. Life will emerge, will persist, will diversify, will fill the planet with forms and processes of stunning intricacy, will eventually produce minds capable of looking back and piecing together the story, of standing in wonder at the immensity of time and the patient creativity of natural processes. And here we are, the descendants of those first replicators, carrying their legacy in every cell, living out the newest chapter in a story that has no ending we can see, only continuation, only the ongoing exploration of what is possible. The ocean still moves, even now, 4 billion years later, still following the pull of the moon, still mixing and cycling, still hosting life in abundance, and somewhere in its depths, chemistry continues, molecules still finding each other, still reacting, still creating complexity from simplicity. We have traveled far from that first shore, in understanding and in time, but we remain connected to it. We are made of the same elements, governed by the same laws, part of the same unfolding story. And in quiet moments, when we let the mind grow still, we can feel that connection, can sense our place in the vast sweep of time. The stars wheel overhead, as they always have, indifferent and magnificent, and beneath them, on this small wet planet, life continues its ancient patterns, being born, growing, reproducing, dying, feeding the next generation, contributing its small variations to the great experiment, adding its thread to the tapestry that has been weaving itself for billions of years. And perhaps that is enough to know that we are here, that we are part of this, that the universe through us has achieved something rare and precious, the ability to contemplate itself, to feel wonder, to create meaning in a cosmos that offers none except what we make. The water moves, the stars turn, and the story goes on as it has, as it will, with or without witnesses, beautiful and terrible and strange beyond measure. The story of the matter learning to think, of chemistry becoming consciousness, of the universe waking up to find itself alive. There is a certain kind of quiet that lives inside music, not the silence between notes, but something deeper, the held breath before a melody begins, the vast, unhurried stillness that seems to gather in the air just before sound takes shape. It is that kind of quiet that drifts through these thoughts tonight, a soft, wondering quality, as if the mind has slowed enough to hear something it usually rushes past. Imagine standing in a grand hall, not any particular hall, but a composite of all such places that have ever existed, stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, tall windows through which the last of the evening light falls in long amber columns, dust suspended in the air like tiny golden planets, each one perfectly still. The walls are lined with portraits, faces from other centuries gazing outward with expressions that are neither stern nor smiling, but simply present, watchful in the way that old things tend to be watchful, as if they have long since decided that patience is the truest form of knowledge. At the far end of the hall there is a harpsichord, its lacquered surface reflecting the candlelight in long, wavering ribbons. The keys yellowed slightly at the edges, the way old ivory tends to yellow, not from neglect, but from use, from the accumulated warmth of thousands of hands that have pressed down upon them over the years, drawing out their thin, bright voices. And there is something in the sight of that instrument, just sitting there, silent, patient, that opens a door in the mind, a door that leads not forward into the next moment, but sideways into the long, slow river of time. This is the world of the great composers, not the world as it appears in concert programs and encyclopedias, not the dates and opus numbers and formal dedications to patrons long since forgotten, but the living world, the world of cold mornings and guttering candles, of ink-stained fingers and manuscripts spread across uneven wooden tables, of whole lifetimes spent in pursuit of something that could never quite be written down fast enough. It is a world that stretches back further than most people imagine, winding through centuries and across an entire continent, threading its way through courts and cathedrals, through the small lamplit rooms of the deeply poor and the vast gilded chambers of the extravagantly wealthy, through revolution and plague and war and an almost unbearable beauty that somehow persisted through all of it. The story of the great composers is not a single story at all. It is more like a great river system, dozens of tributaries flowing into one another, merging and diverging, running fast in certain stretches and then slowing into something wide and contemplative before speeding up again around the next bend. There are names that even those who know little about music will recognize, names that have passed so thoroughly into the fabric of common knowledge that they feel almost mythological. Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, figures so large in the cultural imagination that it can be difficult to remember they were simply people who woke in the mornings uncertain of what the day would bring, people who quarreled and doubted and made mistakes, and sometimes wrote music so transcendent that it seems to belong not to any single human life, but to something vaster and less easily named. And then there are the others, the composers who lived and worked and left behind extraordinary things and yet exist today in a kind of historical shadow. Hildegard von Bingen, composing her luminous sacred melodies in a 12th century German abbey. Claudio Monteverdi, standing at the edge of an entirely new musical world and stepping deliberately into it. George Frederick Handel, filling London's concert halls with sounds so rich and ceremonial that a king once rose to his feet and, by doing so, started a tradition that has persisted for nearly 300 years. These names, the celebrated and the lesser known alike, are part of the same long unfolding, the same gradual centuries-long process of discovery and refinement and reinvention that gave us the music that still drifts out of open windows on summer evenings and fills the darkened interiors of concert halls and plays softly in the background of ordinary moments that somehow become, in retrospect, unforgettable. To think about the great composers is to think about time itself in a particular way, about the strange way that certain things persist while others vanish, about what it means to make something that outlasts the maker by centuries, by half a millennium in some cases, the ink still legible, the notes still singable, the emotions still remarkably, mysteriously intact. There is something in that persistence that invites a kind of slow, wondering attention, a willingness to linger over details, to follow a thread not because it leads somewhere urgent, but because the thread itself is beautiful and the following of it is its own reward. The harpsichord at the end of the hall is still silent, but it is a different kind of silence now, a silence full of implication, full of all the music that has ever been drawn from instruments like it, and all the music that might yet come. The amber light through the windows has deepened slightly, moving toward that particular shade of gold that belongs to the hour just before the sky begins its long descent into blue. And somewhere in that golden air something begins to stir. Not sound exactly, but the memory of sound, or perhaps the anticipation of it, the sense that the long, quiet hall is simply waiting for the right moment to become once again alive with music. Let that sense settle. Let it spread slowly through the mind, the way warmth spreads through a room when a fire is lit for the first time on a cold evening. Because this is where the story begins, not with a dramatic entrance or a moment of sudden clarity, but with exactly this: a hall, a harpsichord, a quality of light, and a willingness to be still long enough to let the past come drifting gently forward. The great composers are gathering, unhurried, from every corner of the centuries, and all that is required is to remain here, in this soft and golden quiet and listen as their stories slowly begin to unfold. The story does not begin where most people expect it to begin. It does not begin with the grand orchestras or the towering symphonies or the names carved into the marble facades of opera houses. It begins much earlier than that, in places that were less about performance and more about devotion, less about entertainment and more about the attempt to reach something sacred through the organized beauty of sound. It begins, in many ways, in the early medieval monasteries of Europe, those quiet, stone-walled communities where the days were measured not by clocks, but by prayer, by the canonical hours that divided each day into intervals of worship and work and contemplative silence. In these places, music was not yet what we would recognize as music. It was something older and more austere, a single melodic line, unharmonized, moving through the air of a cold stone chapel, like a thread of smoke rising from a candle. This was plainchant, known also as Gregorian chant after Pope Gregory I, who according to tradition played a significant role in its codification around the end of the 6th century. Though scholars today understand that the music itself evolved gradually over a much longer period, shaped by many hands and many voices across the span of several centuries, the chant was modal, meaning it operated according to systems of scale and melody that feel unfamiliar to ears trained on modern Western music. There is a floating quality to it, a sense of music that does not resolve in the way we have come to expect, that does not reach for a home note and then settle into it with the comfortable finality of a door clicking shut. Instead, it moves, it wanders purposefully, and in that wandering there is something deeply meditative, something that seems to slow the passage of time rather than mark it. And it was within this tradition, this centuries-long practice of sacred monophonic song, that the first recognizable figure in the history of Western composition emerges from the shadows of history with a voice distinct enough to be called, without hesitation, her own. Her name was Hildegard von Bingen, born in the year 1108 in the Rhineland region of what is now Germany, the 10th child of a noble family who, following the custom of the time, offered her to the church as a kind of spiritual tithe when she was just 8 years old. She spent her early years under the guidance of a woman named Jutta of Sponheim, learning the Psalter and the life of prayer in a small anchorage attached to the monastery of Disibodenberg. And when Jutta died in 1136, Hildegard was chosen by the women in her community to lead them. But what makes Hildegard extraordinary, what lifts her from the historical record as something more than a capable abbess and religious administrator, is the music. From a relatively early age, Hildegard reported experiencing visions, luminous, overwhelming encounters with what she described as the living light, and she was commanded, she believed, to write down what she saw and heard, not merely to record her theological insights, but to transmit the music that seemed to come to her whole and fully formed from somewhere beyond her ordinary mind. Her compositions, gathered into a cycle, she called the Symphonia Harmoni Celestium Revelationum, which might be translated as the Symphony of the Harmony of Celestial Revelations, are unlike anything else from the 12th century. They are expansive where plainchant is restrained, soaring where the tradition counsels measured simplicity. The melodic lines climb to ranges that push the limits of what the human voice can comfortably sustain, as if straining toward the very source from which they came. There is in Hildegard's music a quality that is genuinely difficult to name, a kind of radiant strangeness, something that feels simultaneously ancient and immediate, as if it belongs not to the 12th century specifically, but to some other, less clearly bounded kind of time. She lived until the age of 81, a remarkable span for the medieval period, continuing to compose and write and correspond with popes and emperors and abbots from across Europe. And when she died in 1179, she left behind a body of work that would eventually, many centuries later, be recognized as foundational. But in the centuries immediately following her death, the music of the great composers, or rather the tradition that would eventually give rise to them, was changing in ways that were subtle at first and then quite suddenly transformative. The great shift was polyphony, the addition of a second voice to the single melodic line of plainchant, and then a third, and then a fourth, voices weaving around one another in a texture of simultaneous sound that opened up dimensions of musical experience that the solitary melodic line had never been able to explore. The early experiments in polyphony were cautious, even awkward by later standards. The added voices moving in stiff parallel motion, like shadows following an original at a fixed distance. But gradually, over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, something loosened. The voices began to move independently, to cross one another, to create moments of dissonance, and then, crucially, to resolve those moments into consonance with an effect that was not merely pleasant, but deeply, almost physically satisfying. The center of this development was the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, and the two composers most closely associated with its flowering are known to us only as Léonin and Perrotin. Their full names, their birth dates, the details of their lives, all of this is largely lost to us. They exist in the historical record more as names attached to innovations than as fully rounded human beings. But the innovations themselves are real and lasting. Léonin's Magnus Liber Organi, the Great Book of Organum, represented a systematic and sophisticated approach to polyphonic composition that would influence generations of musicians to come, and Perrotin, who came after him and revised his work, pushed the texture further, writing in 3 and 4 simultaneous voices with a rhythmic complexity that was genuinely new in the world. Listening to Perrotin's Viderunt omnes today, a 4-voice setting of a Gregorian chant that was performed at Notre Dame on the first day of January in the year 1208, is to encounter something that feels both archaic and astonishing. The long, sustained notes of the original chant in the lowest voice, holding steady for what seem like impossible lengths, while 3 upper voices weave an intricate shimmering pattern above it, the whole structure rising and falling with the slow grandeur of something geological. The centuries continued to turn, and the music continued to change. The 14th century brought with it a figure who stands at a significant crossroads in the history of Western music. Guillaume de Machaut, a French poet and composer who was born around 1300 and who lived through some of the most catastrophic events of the medieval period, including the Black Death, which swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351 and killed, by some estimates, between 30 and 60% of the continent's population. Machaut survived, and he continued to compose prolifically even as the world around him fell apart in ways that must have seemed almost incomprehensible to those living through it. He was a churchman, a canon at the Cathedral of Reims, but his music was not exclusively sacred. He wrote secular songs, polyphonic ballades and rondeaux, and virelais, works of considerable elegance and emotional range that spoke not to the eternal and the divine, but to the immediate and the human, to love and longing and the peculiar pleasures of a courtly life. And he wrote the Messe de Notre Dame, the first complete polyphonic setting of the ordinary of the Mass that can be attributed with confidence to a single composer, a work of 4 voices that represents a kind of threshold moment in the history of music, the point at which the large-scale, multi-movement sacred composition becomes, for the first time, a coherent artistic undertaking rather than a collection of separately composed parts. Machaut lived until around 1377, and in the years that followed his death, the tradition he had helped to shape continued to evolve, spreading outward from France into the broader European world. The 15th century brought a group of composers from the region that is now Belgium and the Netherlands, known collectively as the Franco-Flemish school, who would carry polyphonic composition to heights of technical refinement that still astonish musicians and theorists today. The most significant of these early Flemish masters was Guillaume Dufay, born around 1397, a man who spent much of his career in Italy, working for the powerful families and institutions that made the Italian peninsula the most culturally dynamic region of Europe during this period. Dufay wrote in virtually every genre available to him, masses, motets, chansons, and he did so with a fluency and a warmth that set his work apart from the often austere polyphony of his predecessors. There is in Dufay's music a new kind of lyricism, a sense of the melodic line as something that can be not merely correct, but genuinely beautiful in a way that invites the listener simply to follow it, without any need to understand the theoretical structures that support it. His motet Nuper Rosarum Flores, composed for the consecration of the great Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence in 1436, the cathedral with Brunelleschi's vast dome that still dominates the city's skyline, is built on a structural principle of extraordinary sophistication, its 4 voices organized according to proportions drawn from the dimensions of the cathedral itself, a piece of architecture translated into a piece of music, or perhaps a piece of music that aspires to the condition of architecture. After Dufay came Johannes Ockeghem, and after Ockeghem, Josquin des Prez. Josquin, who was born around 1450 and who died in 1521, is perhaps the first composer in the Western tradition whose music feels consistently, unmistakably personal, who sounds across the full range of his output like himself. He was celebrated in his own lifetime in ways that few composers before him had been. The Italian theorist Pietro Aron wrote of him with an admiration that bordered on reverence. And Martin Luther, who knew something about the power of music, called him the master of the notes, implying that where other composers were mastered by their musical material, Josquin mastered it, bending it to his will rather than being bent by it. There is in Josquin's music a new kind of expressive freedom, a willingness to let the shape of the melody be dictated by the meaning of the words it sets, so that the music rises when the text speaks of elevation and falls when it speaks of descent. That seems almost obvious to us now, but was genuinely revolutionary in its time. He stands at the beginning of something, a long tradition of music in which the interior life of the composer, his doubts, his longings, his grief, His wonder begins to show through the surface of the notes in ways that are unmistakable. The hall is quieter now, or perhaps it is simply that the quality of the silence has changed, deepened, taken on some of the weight of all these centuries laid gently one upon another. The harpsichord at the far end is still patient, still waiting, but the air around it seems somehow more inhabited than it was before, as if all these names and all these centuries have settled into it like a fragrance, faint but persistent, and faintly, deeply lovely. The amber light has shifted again. It is cooler now, less golden, and the dust motes that drifted so slowly through it seem to have grown still at last, hanging suspended in the dimming air, like musical notes on a page that no one is currently reading. But somewhere in that stillness, another name is forming, another story beginning to move toward the surface of the memory, because the Renaissance is deepening now, and the music is about to change again in ways that will echo forward through every century that follows. That name is Palestrina, Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, born around 1525 in the small hilltop town of Palestrina, southeast of Rome, a town so thoroughly identified with him that it gave him the surname by which history would remember him. He spent most of his life in Rome, working in the great basilicas and papal institutions that made that city the spiritual and ceremonial center of the Catholic world. And he arrived at precisely the moment when the Church was engaged in one of the most consequential self-examinations in its history. The Council of Trent, which met intermittently between 1545 and 1563, was the Catholic Church's formal response to the Protestant Reformation, a vast, exhausting, decades-long effort to clarify doctrine and reform practice. And among the many things it turned its attention to was the question of music. There were voices within the council that argued church music had become too elaborate, too tangled in its own technical sophistication, that the voices in polyphonic compositions were moving so independently and with such rhythmic complexity that the sacred texts they were meant to illuminate had become unintelligible, buried beneath a web of counterpoint so dense that no listener could follow the words. The story goes, and it is almost certainly embellished, though it contains a truth, that Palestrina composed his Missa Papae Marcelli, the Pope Marcellus Mass, as a demonstration that polyphony could be written in a way that preserved the clarity of the text, that the voices could move in their independent interweaving lines without sacrificing the intelligibility that the council demanded. Whether or not that specific legend is accurate in its details, the music itself is undeniably real and undeniably extraordinary. The Missa Papae Marcelli is a piece of 6 voices, and what is remarkable about it is not complexity but clarity, not the density of its counterpoint but the luminous openness of it, the way the voices seem to breathe together, to make room for one another, to create a texture that is simultaneously rich and transparent. There is a kind of serene authority to Palestrina's music, a sense of things being exactly as they should be, not through any effort or straining toward correctness, but through something that feels more like inevitability, as if the notes could not have been arranged in any other order and been so perfectly themselves. He became, in his own lifetime, and even more decisively after his death, the model of what sacred polyphonic composition should be, the gold standard against which generations of later composers would measure themselves, and the study of his style, what theorists would come to call strict counterpoint, or the Palestrina style, became, and in many conservatories remains, one of the foundational exercises of a formal musical education. But while Palestrina was perfecting one kind of music in Rome, something entirely different was stirring in the city of Venice. Venice in the second half of the 16th century was unlike anywhere else in Europe. A city built on water, trading with the entire known world, wealthy and cosmopolitan and deeply proud of its own distinctiveness. A city that did things its own way, including music. The Basilica of San Marco, the great domed Byzantine-inflected church at the heart of the city, had a unique architectural feature that changed the way music was composed and performed within its walls. Two choir lofts facing one another from opposite sides of the nave, each containing an organ and a choir. This physical arrangement gave rise to a compositional technique that the Venetians called cori spezzati, split choirs, the practice of writing music for two or more distinct ensembles that could answer one another across the space of the church, trading melodic phrases back and forth like a conversation, or joining together at moments of climax into a single, overwhelming wall of sound. The great master of this Venetian style was Giovanni Gabrieli, who held the position of principal organist at San Marco from 1585 until his death in 1612, and whose sacred symphonies and canzonas for multiple choirs and instruments represent one of the most spectacular achievements in all of Renaissance music. Gabrieli was among the first composers to write out specific dynamic markings in his scores, instructing performers to play certain passages piano, softly, and others forte, loudly, a practice that seems unremarkable to us now, but was genuinely innovative at the time, a recognition that the expressive range of music extended beyond pitch and rhythm into the dimension of volume itself. And it was one of Gabrieli's students, a young German organist who came to Venice to study and who absorbed everything the Venetian master had to teach, who would carry these ideas northward into the German-speaking world and plant them in soil where they would eventually produce something extraordinary. That student was Heinrich Schütz, born in 1585, and in many ways the most important figure in the history of German music before Johann Sebastian Bach. Schütz spent his career navigating the almost unimaginable difficulties of the 30 Years' War, which tore through the German-speaking lands from 1618 to 1648, with a ferocity and duration that left the region economically devastated and demographically shattered. Some estimates suggest that the German territories lost as much as a third of their population during this period. He continued to compose through it all, adapting, economizing when resources were scarce, writing smaller and more intimate works when the elaborate forces required for his larger pieces could no longer be assembled, and the music that emerged from this long period of difficulty has a quality of hard-won tenderness to it, a depth of feeling that seems inseparable from the suffering that surrounded it. But the tradition that Schütz helped to establish in Germany would reach its culmination, its most complete and overwhelming expression, in the person of a man born in the small Thuringian town of Eisenach on the 21st of March, 1685, Johann Sebastian Bach. The name settles into the air of the hall like a stone settling to the bottom of a very still, very deep pool, sending ripples outward in all directions, slowly, measurably, reaching every shore. Bach was born into a family for whom music was simply the natural medium of existence. The Bach family had been producing musicians for generations before Johann Sebastian arrived, and would continue producing them after, but none of them before or since approached what he achieved. He spent most of his life in relatively modest circumstances, working as a court musician and organist in provincial German towns, Arnstadt, Mühlhausen, Weimar, Köthen, and finally, from 1723 until his death in 1750 as the Thomas Cantor in Leipzig, the director of music at the city's main Lutheran churches, a position of considerable civic importance, but not, by any measure, one of the grandest appointments in the musical world of his time. He was not, during his lifetime, regarded as one of the great figures of European music. He was respected as an organist of formidable skill, and known among specialists for the technical sophistication of his compositions. But the broader musical public of his era was beginning to move in directions that left his elaborate counterpoint sounding, to some ears, old-fashioned. His music was not widely published. Much of it circulated only in manuscript, copied out by hand and passed among a small community of initiates, and when he died, a large portion of his output was simply dispersed, sold off, lost, used as wrapping paper or kindling, the casual indifference of history to even its greatest achievements. And yet what survives is staggering. The well-tempered clavier, 2 sets of 24 preludes and fugues, 1 in each major and minor key, exploring the full range of harmonic possibility with a comprehensiveness that seems less like composition and more like a complete mapping of a universe. The Mass in B minor, a work of such scope and magnificence that it was never performed in its entirety during Bach's lifetime, assembled from pieces composed across the span of decades, and unified by a vision so coherent it seems impossible that so much time separated its various parts. The Brandenburg Concertos, 6 works for varying instrumental combinations, each one a different solution to the same basic compositional problem, each one so perfect in its solution that the problem seems to disappear entirely, leaving only the music. The Goldberg Variations, an aria followed by 30 variations of such diversity and ingenuity that the whole structure functions less like a piece of music than like a meditation on the nature of identity, on what it means for something to remain itself through every possible transformation. Bach worked every day of his professional life, composing, teaching, performing, copying, raising 20 children with 2 wives, of whom 10 survived to adulthood, managing the daily business of the Leipzig music program, which required him to produce a new cantata for performance in church virtually every week during the liturgical year. He composed over 200 cantatas that have survived. The actual number he wrote was likely higher, possibly around 300, each one a complete, self-contained world of music lasting perhaps 20 minutes, each one written to illuminate a specific text from the Lutheran liturgy for a specific Sunday or feast day. The scale of this output is almost incomprehensible, but perhaps even more incomprehensible than the quantity is the quality, the consistency of invention week after week, year after year, the sense that the pressure of the deadline never diminished the depth of the thought, that the routine of the liturgical calendar somehow generated not repetition but perpetual renewal. And yet Bach worked in deliberate isolation from the other great musical mind of his generation, a man who had been born in the same year in a German town not far from Eisenach, and who had taken his extraordinary gifts in an entirely different direction, George Friedrich Handel, born in Halle in 1685, just 1 month before Bach, was everything that Bach, in worldly terms, was not: cosmopolitan, celebrated, financially successful, a figure who moved easily among the aristocracies of Europe, and who understood with a sure instinct exactly what audiences wanted to hear and how to give it to them. He left Germany as a young man, spent formative years in Italy absorbing the Italian operatic style at its source, and then settled in London, where he remained for the rest of his long life, becoming so thoroughly identified with his adopted country that he was eventually naturalized as a British subject and given a state funeral in Westminster Abbey when he died in 1759. Handel was above all a man of the theatre. His operas, composed in the Italian style for the London stage, occupied the center of his career for decades. Elaborate, expensive productions featuring the greatest singers of the age, works of considerable dramatic sophistication that would eventually fall out of fashion and then, in the 20th century, be rediscovered and celebrated once more. But it is the oratorios that have kept his name alive in the popular imagination, those large-scale sacred works for soloists, chorus, and orchestra that Handel turned to when the economics of Italian opera in London became too uncertain, and which he found, to his own apparent surprise, to be the medium in which his gifts found their most complete expression. The most famous of them needs no introduction: Messiah, composed in the astonishing span of 24 days in August and September of 1741, a work that spans the full arc of Christian theology, from prophecy through incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection to final triumph. The Hallelujah Chorus, at whose first London performance in 1743 King George II reportedly rose to his feet, whether from religious reverence or simply because he had arrived late and was confused, no one can say with certainty, and in rising caused everyone else in the hall to rise as well, establishing by royal precedent a tradition of standing that persists in performances around the world to this day. Handel and Bach, the two great summits of the Baroque era, born in the same year, never meeting, their careers tracing such different paths through the same musical landscape. Bach died in 1750, and Handel followed 9 years later. And with their passing, something that had been building for a century and a half, the great polyphonic tradition of the Baroque, reached its conclusion. But even before they were gone, a new kind of music was already forming in the minds of the next generation, lighter, clearer, more symmetrical, less interested in the elaborate weaving of voices and more interested in the elegant presentation of a single singing melodic line above a simple supporting harmony. The world was changing, and the music, as it always does, was changing with it, preparing to become something that its predecessors could not quite have imagined, and yet, in some essential way, had made possible. The hall seems to breathe very slowly, as if registering the passage of so much time through its patient walls. The new music had a name, or rather it had several names that scholars would later argue over and eventually settle into an uneasy consensus about. But the one that has endured is the classical period, and its great center of gravity in the second half of the 18th century was the city of Vienna. Vienna in those decades was something extraordinary, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, one of the largest and most complex political entities in Europe, a city of palaces and coffee houses, of aristocratic patronage and emerging middle-class culture, a city where music was not merely an ornament to life, but something close to its organizing principle. The new style that was crystallizing in Vienna and in the courts and cities surrounding it was built on different foundations than the Baroque had been, where Bach had woven voices together in textures of almost mathematical density. The new music prized transparency, where the Baroque had moved in long, continuous, forward-pressing phrases. The classical style favored shorter, more balanced structures, phrases that asked a question and then answered it, melodies that departed and then came home. The man most responsible for establishing the formal architecture of this new style, the sonata, the string quartet, the symphony in its mature form, was a composer who was in many ways the least assuming figure imaginable for so consequential a role. Franz Joseph Haydn, born in 1732 in the small Austrian village of Rohrau, the son of a wheelwright, a man of cheerful temperament and remarkable creative longevity, who spent nearly 30 years in the service of the wealthy Esterházy family, living and working at their remote Hungarian estate of Esterháza in a kind of productive isolation that he himself described in retrospect as a gift. Because he was isolated, he told a visitor late in his life, he was forced to be original. He served the Esterházy princes faithfully and inventively for decades, composing symphonies, string quartets, operas, and masses on demand, and in doing so he essentially invented, or at the very least perfected, the forms that would define Western classical music for the next century. His 104 symphonies trace, across the span of his long career, the entire development of the form from its relatively modest early incarnations to the grand, emotionally expansive late works he composed after the death of his patron finally freed him to travel to London, where he was received with a celebrity that astonished him, and where the 12 symphonies he wrote for those visits, the London Symphonies as they are known, represent some of the finest orchestral music of the entire century. But even as Haydn was doing all of this, even as he was quietly, patiently, systematically building the architecture of classical music from the ground up, there arrived in Vienna a figure so extraordinary that he seemed to belong to a different order of creation entirely. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, born in Salzburg on the 27th of January, 1756, the son of Leopold Mozart, himself a musician and composer of some accomplishment, who recognized almost immediately that the child before him represented something unprecedented. By the time Mozart was 6 years old, he was performing at the courts of Europe, astonishing audiences in Vienna and Paris and London, with a facility at the keyboard that seemed to defy explanation. Not merely the mechanical facility of a well-trained child, but something more unsettling, a musicality so complete, so instinctive, that observers struggled to find language for it. He had, according to numerous credible accounts, absolute pitch, the ability to identify and reproduce any note heard without any external reference. And more than that, a capacity for musical memory so extraordinary that at the age of 14 he heard a performance of Allegri's Miserere in the Sistine Chapel, a work whose notation the Vatican kept secret and forbade to be copied, and afterward wrote out the entire piece from memory with virtually no errors. But the prodigy became a composer of a different and deeper kind of greatness, one that had less to do with facility and more to do with understanding, with the ability to find within the elegant formal structures of the classical style a kind of emotional truth that the style itself had not previously seemed capable of containing. His symphonies, and he wrote 41 of them, the last 3 composed in the summer of 1788, within the span of just 6 weeks, move through emotional landscapes of considerable complexity, with a lightness of touch that makes the complexity feel effortless, as if the depth were simply always there, available to anyone willing to listen carefully enough to notice it. His piano concertos, 27 of them, are among the most perfect things in all of music, works in which the relationship between the soloist and the orchestra becomes a kind of drama, an ongoing negotiation between individual voice and collective expression that contains within its formal conventions more genuine feeling than most music manages in far less constrained circumstances. And the operas, The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, Così fan tutte, The Magic Flute, works that somehow manage to be simultaneously funny and heartbreaking, light and profound, perfectly constructed and overflowing with the kind of spontaneous seeming inspiration that makes listeners feel they are experiencing not a composed artifact, but a living event, but a living. Mozart died in Vienna in 1791 at the age of 35. The cause of his death has been debated for 2 centuries and will probably never be definitively established, and the circumstances of his burial, in a common grave, according to the Viennese practice of the time, without ceremony or marker, have given his death a melancholy quality that seems almost too perfectly symbolic to be accidental. But among the mourners at the small ceremony held before his burial was a young composer who had arrived in Vienna from Bonn the previous month, burning with ambition, full of plans to study with Mozart that would now never be realized. His name was Ludwig van Beethoven, and what he would do over the next 4 decades would shake the foundations of everything that had come before. Beethoven was born in Bonn in 1770, into a family troubled by poverty and his father's alcoholism. His early musical education was rigorous and sometimes harsh, his father recognizing the boy's gifts and pushing him with an urgency that had more to do with financial desperation than with genuine pedagogical care. He came to Vienna and studied with Haydn, a relationship that was productive but uneasy, each man somewhat puzzled by the other, and then gradually, in the 1790s, he began to make his name as a pianist of extraordinary power and originality, someone whose playing had a quality of volcanic force that contemporary accounts describe with a consistency that makes the impression feel real across the distance of 2 centuries. And then the hearing began to go. The first signs appeared when Beethoven was in his late 20s, and by his early 30s he was living with the knowledge that he was losing the one sense that his entire life had been built around, the sense without which the life he had made for himself would seem to almost anyone to be impossible to continue. He wrote about it with remarkable candor in a document known as the Heiligenstadt Testament, a letter addressed to his brothers that was found among his papers after his death and never sent, in which he described the despair of his situation and the decision he had made to continue living and working in spite of it. What emerged from that decision was music that could not have been written by anyone who had not passed through such darkness. The Third Symphony, the Eroica, composed in 1803 and 1804, was originally dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, in whom Beethoven saw the embodiment of the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality. And then, when Napoleon declared himself emperor, Beethoven scratched the dedication out so violently that he tore through the paper, a small, furious gesture that speaks volumes about the man and about the convictions he carried with him throughout his life. The Eroica changed everything. It was nearly twice the length of any symphony that had come before it. It moved through emotional states of a complexity and volatility that the classical symphony had never previously attempted, and it announced, as clearly as any musical work has ever announced anything, that a new era had begun. The 9 symphonies that Beethoven wrote over the course of his career trace a journey so comprehensive and so deeply personal that listening to them in sequence feels less like a survey of musical history and more like accompanying a single extraordinary consciousness through the full range of its experience. The Fifth Symphony, with its famous 4-note opening motif, which Beethoven himself reportedly described as fate, knocking at the door, though the attribution is uncertain, building from that single gesture an entire architecture of struggle and eventual triumph. The Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, a landscape of sound so vivid and so affectionate in its rendering of the natural world that it seems to capture not merely the sights and sounds of the countryside, but the particular quality of attention with which a person deeply in love with the natural world receives it. The Seventh Symphony, which Wagner would later call the apotheosis of the dance, a work of such rhythmic energy and formal inevitability that it seems to be powered by something other than human will. And the Ninth, completed in 1824, by which time Beethoven was completely deaf, a work that ends with a choral finale setting Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy, a declaration of universal brotherhood so vast in its ambition and so overwhelming in its execution that it seems to exceed the boundaries of what music was previously understood to be capable of. At the premiere of the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven stood on the stage facing the orchestra, following the score, conducting his own internal version of the piece, while the actual performance took place around him, and he could hear none of it. And when it was over, the audience erupted in an ovation that he could not hear, and it was one of the soloists who came to him and gently turned him around to face the hall so that he could see what he could not hear. The people on their feet, waving their handkerchiefs, overcome. Beethoven died in Vienna in 1827, and the funeral procession drew an estimated 20,000 people into the streets of the city. The Romantic era that followed, built directly on the foundations Beethoven had laid, but it moved in directions that he could not have fully anticipated, directions shaped by the particular character of the 19th century, with its nationalism and its sentimentality, its cult of the individual artist as a kind of secular prophet, its fascination with nature and with the exotic, its hunger for emotion that was not merely felt, but demonstrably, publicly, overwhelmingly felt. Franz Schubert, who was only 31 years old when Beethoven died, and who would himself die just 18 months later at the age of 31, had already, in his brief life, produced a body of work of staggering richness, over 600 songs alone, plus symphonies, piano sonatas, chamber music, and the unfinished Eighth Symphony, whose 2 movements contain more genuine mystery than most composers manage in a lifetime of complete works. And then there was the generation that came after, Schumann and Chopin, who were born within months of one another in 1810, Liszt, born in 1811, Brahms, born in 1833, and in another tradition that flowed from Germany, but carried its own unmistakable national character, the Russian composers Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, who brought the folk melodies and emotional temperament of their vast and ancient country into the concert halls of Europe with an effect that was at first startling and then, quickly, irresistible. Each of these figures deserves more time than can be given here. Each one a world unto themselves, a complete artistic vision that took decades to develop and that left behind, at the end, a testament to the depths of human feeling that the music of any given century can reach. And the century turned again, as centuries always do, with a mixture of relief and apprehension, carrying with it the accumulated weight of all that had come before and the half-formed sense that something new was approaching, something that would require music to reckon once more with the question it has always been asking in one form or another. What is it exactly that sound can say that no other medium can say quite so completely, quite so directly, quite so irreducibly? The answer to that question has never been fixed. It shifts with each generation, with each new voice that arrives to test the boundaries of what music is and what it can do. And in that shifting, in that perpetual willingness to begin the inquiry again from the beginning, lies perhaps the deepest secret of why the great composers continue to matter, why their music still finds its way to us across the centuries, still lands with something that feels less like information and more like recognition. The hall holds all of this very gently now, the way old stone holds warmth long after the sun has moved past the window and the room has grown dim. There is something worth sitting with for a moment, that persistent question of what music actually does to the people who receive it, because the answer that the great composers seemed to arrive at, each in their own way and each in their own time, was not the answer one might expect. It was not that music communicates emotion in the way that language communicates information, passing a specific content from one mind to another with reasonable fidelity. It was something stranger than that, something that resists the kind of clean summary that language is built to provide. When Chopin sat at the piano in the lamplit drawing rooms of Paris, his fingers moving across the keys with that particular combination of delicacy and force that his contemporaries described with such consistent wonder, what was happening in the room was not simply the transmission of sadness or longing or nostalgia, though all of those things were certainly present. What was happening was closer to the creation of a space, a specific temporary interior architecture that the listener could inhabit, a place that had the proportions of Chopin's own inner world, but that each listener furnished unconsciously with the particular contents of their own. This is perhaps why the same nocturne can mean such different things to different people, and such different things to the same person at different moments in their life. The music is not telling you what to feel. It is opening a room and leaving you in it. And what you find there is always, in some sense, yourself. Brahms understood this. Johannes Brahms, who was born in Hamburg in 1833 and who carried within him a conservatism so profound that it looked to some of his contemporaries like timidity, like an unwillingness to follow where Liszt and Wagner were leading, into music that stretched and strained the old forms until they could no longer contain it. But Brahms's conservatism was not timidity. It was a particular kind of faith, a belief that the forms inherited from Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven were not constraints to be escaped, but vessels capable of holding more than they had yet been asked to hold, that there was still more to be discovered within the boundaries of the symphony and the sonata, than the century had yet imagined. His 4 symphonies, the first of which he did not complete and premiere until he was 43 years old, so seriously did he take the responsibility of following in Beethoven's footsteps, are among the most fully inhabited works in the entire orchestral repertoire, music that rewards not the first hearing but the 100th, that gives up its secrets slowly, in layers, over the course of a lifetime of listening. And then there was Wagner, Richard Wagner, born in Leipzig in 1813, is perhaps the most controversial figure in all of music, a man whose personal character was, by virtually every account, deeply unpleasant, vain, manipulative, anti-Semitic, willing to use and discard people with a casual cruelty that appalls even those who love his music, and whose artistic achievement was so immense, so thoroughly transformative, that the history of Western music is cleanly divided into before and after. His music dramas, The Ring Cycle, Tristan und Isolde, Parsifal, reimagined what opera could be, discarding the Italian convention of separate arias and recitatives in favor of an unbroken, continuously evolving musical fabric, a texture he called endless melody that moves and shifts and develops over the course of hours without ever fully stopping to let the audience settle into the comfortable familiarity of a repeated tune. The harmonic language of Tristan und Isolde, in particular, pushed tonality, the system of keys and harmonic relationships that had organized Western music for nearly 3 centuries, to the very edge of its coherence, and in doing so pointed toward a dissolution that would be completed by the composers of the following generation. Because what came after Wagner was the question of what to do with the harmonic inheritance he had left behind, an inheritance so rich and so destabilized that it could not simply be continued, only either abandoned or exploded. Gustav Mahler chose, in some sense, to do both at once. His 9 completed symphonies, composed in the decades around the turn of the 20th century, are vast, turbulent, contradictory things, works that contain within themselves the whole range of the Austro-German musical tradition, from folk song to the most sophisticated orchestral counterpoint that can shift within a few measures, from the naively simple to the overwhelmingly complex, from what sounds like a child's song to what sounds like the end of the world. Mahler said that a symphony must contain everything, and his own symphonies strain toward that impossible totality with an urgency that can feel at times almost frightening. And even as Mahler was writing his enormous symphonies in Vienna, a younger composer in the same city was quietly assembling the materials for a revolution that would change the sound of Western music more completely than anything since the invention of polyphony 1,000 years earlier. Arnold Schoenberg, who was born in Vienna in 1874 and who began his career writing music in the late romantic style of Brahms and Wagner, arrived through a process of gradual harmonic radicalization that he himself experienced as inevitable and necessary at the complete abandonment of tonality. His 12-tone system, in which all 12 notes of the chromatic scale are treated as equal, with no single note privileged as a home base, was an attempt to find a new principle of musical organization to replace the tonal system that Wagner had eroded and that Schoenberg himself had finally dissolved. The music that resulted was unlike anything that had been heard before, angular, dissonant, intellectually rigorous, emotionally intense in a way that bypassed the usual melodic and harmonic pathways to emotion and arrived, when it arrived at all, through roots that felt newly excavated. It was not music that was immediately loved by the general public, and in some ways it has never been widely loved, and yet its influence on the course of 20th century music was so pervasive that even composers who explicitly rejected its premises were defining themselves, consciously or not, in relation to it. The 20th century was a century of pluralism in music, of many different answers being proposed simultaneously to the questions that the dissolution of tonality had raised. Stravinsky's rhythmic primitivism, Bartók's synthesis of folk music and modernist technique, Shostakovich's bitter, sometimes desperate negotiation between artistic integrity and political survival under the Soviet regime, the minimalism of Arvo Pärt and Philip Glass, the spectral music of Gerhard Grisi, the American vernacular traditions that flowed in from jazz and blues and gospel and reshaped the entire global musical landscape, all of it flowing from the same deep source, all of it part of the same long, unbroken river that began in the stone chapels of the early medieval monasteries and has been finding its way forward ever since. The great composers, seen from a sufficient distance, form a kind of conversation across the centuries, each one responding to what came before, building on it, or pushing against it, or finding in some corner of it a neglected possibility that turns out to contain entire worlds. Bach knew Buxtehude's work and walked 200 miles on foot to hear him play. Beethoven studied with Haydn and carried Mozart's spirit in him like a living flame. Brahms revered Beethoven, and Schoenberg revered Brahms with an admiration that his own radical departures never diminished. Mahler conducted Wagner's operas and was changed by them. Debussy heard Javanese gamelan music at the Paris Exposition of 1889 and heard in those interlocking, shimmering textures a permission to let Western music breathe in an entirely new way. The conversation never ends. It only deepens, accumulating new voices and new perspectives, while somehow never losing the thread that connects it back to its origins, to the first solitary melodic line rising from a cold stone floor in the early morning, when the only light came through small windows and the only purpose was to reach, through the organized beauty of sound, towards something that lay beyond the reach of ordinary words. The hall is very quiet now, a different kind of quiet from the one that opened this long drifting evening, not the anticipatory silence of a room waiting to be filled, but the full silence of a room that has been inhabited by many things and holds them still, invisibly, in the texture of its air. The candles have burned lower, their flames smaller now, steadier, less inclined to flicker, as if they too have settled into something quieter and more concentrated after the long evening's journey. The harpsichord at the far end of the hall is still, and will remain still now for the rest of the night, its keys a little warmer, perhaps, than they were at the beginning, as if all the music that has moved through the mind this evening has left some small residue of warmth, even in an instrument that was never actually played. The portraits on the walls, those faces from other centuries, seem in the low light to have softened slightly the severity that formal portraiture tends to impose upon its subjects, giving way, in the mind's eye, to something more human, more recognizably the faces of people who felt things deeply, who struggled and doubted and found. In music, a way of making sense of the world that nothing else quite provided. Hildegard, looking toward a light that she described as living, Bach, bent over a manuscript in the early hours, surrounded by children and obligations and the perpetual pressure of the next Sunday's cantata. Mozart, writing by candlelight with that uncanny speed that seemed to those around him less like composition and more like transcription. Beethoven, placing his hands on the piano to feel its vibration through his skin, conducting an orchestra he could not hear, each of them giving everything they had, not to be remembered, though some of them hoped for that, not to change the world, though several of them did, but simply to follow the music wherever it led, for as long as they were able, with as much fidelity and as much courage as they could bring to the task. There is something in that dedication, something in the image of a person sitting down at a desk or a keyboard or an organ bench and reaching for something they cannot quite name but recognize when they find it, that feels less like a historical phenomenon and more like a description of something permanent, something that belongs not to any particular century, but to the ongoing human project of trying to be fully alive. The last of the amber light has faded from the windows now. The room is all soft shadow and the small steady glow of the remaining candles. The night fully arrived at last, complete in its gentle darkness. And in that darkness, if one listens very carefully, not straining, not searching, but simply remaining open to whatever is already there, it is possible to hear something that is not quite music and not quite silence, but belongs to the space between them, the space where all the music that has ever been played still lives, quietly, alongside all the music that has not yet been written, patient, unhurried, perfectly still, waiting for the next person who sits down and listens closely enough to hear it and is moved once again to try to write it down.